We are about to have a vote, so we're going to be interrupted very, very shortly, but let's crack on as quickly as we can. We will now hear evidence from Victoria Hills, the Chief Executive Officer of the Royal Town Planning Institute, Hugh Ellis, Director of Policy at the Town and Country Planning Association, Faraz Barber of the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. For this panel, we'll have until 2:35, unless, of course, we have a vote, which we're expecting, which will then change the timing. So I call on the opposition to start the questions. And if you can indicate to me early that you may want to ask a question, that would be very helpful to me and the clerk.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for coming here this afternoon. I'm going to speak slightly more slowly than I usually do, just to try and drag this out so we can go and vote and then give you the scrutiny and the respect that you deserve at the committee this afternoon. I just wanted to ask a question to the Town and Country Planning Association, apologies, about the level of public trust within the current planning system. We as a party, as Shadow Minister, we've outlined consistently during the second reading of this legislation that we are concerned about the democratic oversight and the right of the public and of local planning committees to have a decent and worthwhile say in the way in which they allow developments to go ahead within their own remit and within their own jurisdictions. And I noticed that in the written representations that you've made in terms of public trust, you outline that if the planning system is to be democratic, it is essential that the public has a voice during the examination of plans. This includes for the new and powerful spatial development strategies. So I just wondered if you could outline to the committee, if you could elaborate on that view and outline to the committee what amendments or what emphasis you would like to see change to fulfil some of the concerns that you have in this area.
Yes, certainly. There are two aspects to it. One, public trust is at a very low level. There's not been a full examination of public participation in planning since the late 1960s. And wherever we go, we find people who are struggling to understand the system, struggling with the asymmetry when they come up against the development industry very often, and struggling with the very limited opportunities that the communities have to participate, which are described in statute both for national infrastructure and for local planning applications, and gives people 3 weeks. The most important thing to stress is that people are not a source of delay. Their voice in planning is due process. And taking out democratic opportunities in the cause of speeding up is utterly counterproductive, because where communities resist, they create delay anyway outside the system. So for us, there needs to be a respectful conversation. Of course, it's not a veto that we're arguing for, but we're arguing for meaningful opportunities for communities to be involved. That leads to better development, more accepted development, better placemaking. And so our concerns about the bill are particularly about the scheme of delegation, particularly about shortening consultation periods in terms of national infrastructure. To put that right, what we're suggesting is that things like the scheme of delegation aren't really necessary. Certainly that if you're going to do it, you have to preserve local democratic oversight of major decisions at the local level. And just as one final quick example of that, if you have a scheme of delegation that takes out local democratic oversight of decisions, you also take out the community's only right in development management to be heard at a planning committee. So the point I want to stress is that at the moment, communities are the people largely excluded from decision making, and we want to give them a powerful voice. That is not anti-development. That is about building legitimacy and consent and certainty for development.
And we on the side of the House absolutely agree with you in that, and we appreciate your frankness in your written representations to this committee. If I could come to Victoria Hills, one of the areas that in the line of this area of questioning in terms of local planning authorities and the powers that they have with the democratic oversight. One of your interesting proposals is to propose an amendment that would allow a statutory chief planning officer per local planning authority. I find that particularly interesting because I can see the argument that you would have that increased legitimacy with one planning officer per local planning authority, despite the fact that we already have those. But there's one person that's vested within each authority to make those decisions. Can you just outline how you would see that work with the political structures that are in place in local authorities, bearing in mind the legislative aims that this bill is putting forward by, we would argue, removing some of those powers from locally elected councillors and politicians?
Well, thank you very much for the question, and you're absolutely right. One of our core asks and core pillars, we believe, of the quite systemic change coming through the Planning and Infrastructure Bill is the need to have a statutory chief planning officer in every local authority. If you want innovation driven, if you want change, if you want delivery of a new planning system, a new planning and infrastructure bill sets an ambitious drumbeat for how planning will be done going forward, then really to mobilise that delivery, you need to ensure you have the appropriate seniority, the appropriate experience, the appropriate professional competency of a senior leader, not elected, executive leader, who can be working with the elected politicians locally to drive forward delivery of the planning reform that sits before this committee today. So we feel that many of the changes that are proposed in the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, some of which are quite structural about the way that planning will be done differently in the future, requires not only strong elected leadership, but requires strong executive leadership.
We will resume in 25 minutes, so that'll be 14, just before 14. So 14:30.
response from yourself, Victoria Hills, about your proposal to bring in a chief planning officer. I didn't, because we were voting, I don't know if you wanted to finish the point that you were making, or whether you're content with what you said before we went.
Well, thank you very much. And the point I was making was that if you want to be able to mobilise delivery quickly, if you've gone to the effort of producing a new planning and infrastructure bill and getting all the bits and pieces in place that you need to deliver the growth that we know the government has committed to deliver, then it makes sense to have someone with the appropriate level of seniority, experience and competency within local government who can actually drive forward that delivery. There are a number of changes that are proposed in the bill to do planning slightly differently, and we think within that context you absolutely need a statutory chief planning officer working with the local politicians to deliver what the communities want to see locally. So this is a golden opportunity within the premise of the bill to ensure that we put that role in place in statute so that communities can be assured that as these changes go through, that they have that right level of seniority competency working with the elected politicians to deliver the changes that they would like to see locally. So we support much of what's in the bill, but we do feel it would be a missed opportunity not to introduce the provision for a statutory chief planning officer. You mentioned that these people exist. Well, they exist at different levels, in different shades, in different authorities. What we want to do, very much along the lines of the conformity that I believe the bill is trying to bring in for planning committees, if you are going to bring in a new national scheme of delegation for planning committees, you really do need to have a statutory chief planning officer who can deliver that scheme locally, working hand in hand with the politicians to do so. Thank you.
Thank you. And one very brief question, just to change tack slightly, and I'd appreciate it if each witness could just give a short answer to this, because I know we've got other colleagues that want to come in. The last witness that we had was the Chief Executive of Natural England, and there were, as you will know, this is one of the most controversial parts of the legislation in terms of habitats and nature. And there was, and I don't want to put words into her mouth because she's now not here, but towards the committee she said that there was some concern with the new systems over potential shortfalls in funding because of the spending review, which hasn't yet, of course, allocated money in the short term to Natural England, compared to the extra responsibilities that Natural England will have to undertake in terms of habitat and nature. Can you just outline your relevant organisations or your individual organisations' views as to whether you think Natural England is adequately resourced at the moment to undertake those extra duties going forward? And do you think that it's in a fit state under its current guise and funding to be able to deliver those extra responsibilities going forward?
I'm happy to go first.
Yep.
We have been very clear in our position that we support Natural England taking forward some of these new powers and responsibilities, provided that they are adequately resourced to do it. I don't have a detailed diagnostic of their resourcing and capability plans, but we have been assured, working with the department, that those resources will be there. That is something that we'll be keeping a very close eye on. So we support the principle of coming up with strategic solutions to some of the approaches to environment which can be delivered at a strategic level. As you know, we're a strong supporter of strategic planning, and we believe some of the nature, biodiversity and natural aspects of planning do not stop at district council boundaries or even county council boundaries. It makes perfect sense to look at these things at a strategic level, and we do support that, and we support the ambition of Natural England to do it. But we will caveat it by saying they must be adequately resourced to do so, and that is a point that we will continue to make.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. So I work for a planning, environment and design company called Landpro, which operates across the country. And I guess with that lens, I make the response of saying the sort of provisions and expectations of what's wanted from here and what Natural England will have to sort of effectively deliver are right. And it's a good move in which way the government are moving towards the delivery of the EDPs and all those things that sit around it. The challenge, which I thought was interesting when we heard Natural England early, was the on the face of the bill, she was sort of challenged, are these going to be able to cast iron and give you the guarantee of the environmental credentials you need to see come through? And I had to say I was surprised at that response, insofar as you can't, because we have to see how it works in practice. And in order for Natural England to be able to deliver that, it will need to significantly recruit dedicated teams to operate a number of the provisions that are set out in this bill, notably the EDPs being a good example of that. And so I think it's right that there will be concern around the comprehensive spending review and whether they will have the resources and the function to deliver that. But in principle, I think the government is right in its direction of travel on this, but it will need to commit to the resources and funding for it to deliver its promise.
Thank you. Mr. Ellis?
Only to say, to add to that rather than repeat it, is that there are concerns about the scheme design. And there's also a concern we have at the TCPA about the philosophy that lies behind it, if it leads to an offsetting process. To be really clear about it, the foundation of planning is that nature and development can be easily managed together to enhance both. That's our tradition, always been planning tradition from Morris onwards. And so the philosophy of planning should always be that I can build a development for you that will enhance nature and provide housing. And the setting up of the two ideas in opposition, I think, is quite destructive, and it's also distracting. We need to be able to be focusing on design quality in new housing, and principally that allows people to have access to nature immediately, and they need that for their mental health and physical well-being. That is a crucial saving to the NHS and social care budget in the long run. So what we want is that really high quality design first, and offsetting and large-scale habitat creation elsewhere as a second resort, but not as the first principal test.
Thank you very much. No more questions.
Ellie Chance.
Thank you, Mr. Twigg. Can I ask you, perhaps you first, Mr. Ellis, because I think it follows on. What do you think the purpose of planning should be, and do you think that should be written into the bill?
Since 1947, the greatest absence in all planning reform measures is we don't know what the system's for. And the current round of reforms raises that question profoundly. The purpose should be sustainable development. We are signatories to the UN Charter, and key concepts around sustainable development do not feature in the National Planning Policy Framework, and they're really crucial ones. They're ones about social justice, inclusion, environmental limits, precautionary principles. Those are all key to give the planning system a purpose. That purpose is crucial pragmatically because we all, across sector, need to know what the system is for so we can have confidence in it. And it's also crucial to understand that the system has long-term goals, the future of future generations being one of those, but also, for example, the climate crisis. So, within 3 to 5 years, the repeated impacts from climate change will be the dominant political issue we're confronting, and we need a system that works for that as well as works for housing growth.
Whether it should be on the face of the bill or in the bill or in a NPPF style document is something I think is more about whether there is the ability for people to know what planning is and how is that communicated. I don't necessarily believe it's got to be enshrined in the bill or in the Act, but it certainly should be clear whether it's in a national policy planning framework or it should be in a local plan or an SDS, where actually people can understand, and that by I mean all those that interact with the planning system, to know what planning is about and what it means for them. I sort of feel it being put into a bill or ultimately an Act feels like the wrong place it would be enshrined.
And the first part of my question, what do you think the purpose of planning should be?
Well, planning is there to help, for want of a better place, help with the placemaking, help with the delivery, help to ensure that there are guidelines of how plan making should take place, and that all the various levers that associate the plan making process and the development process are understood, that planning is the guardian to hold effectively how sustainable development can come forward.
Thank you. Ms. Hill? Thank you. One of the most important questions anybody can ask elected leaders, executive leaders, is why? Why are we doing it? What's it all about? What is the purpose of this bill? What is the purpose of planning? And that's why we think it is absolutely essential within the realms of this bill that there is a public purpose of planning stated up front. But you don't have to take our word for it. Our research published yesterday shows the vast majority of the public haven't got a clue what planning is. They don't know what it's for, And if you're going to be driving through a major reform programme of planning, the like of which we haven't seen for 15 years, it might be a good idea if we were very clear as to what the purpose of planning was. And for us, it's really rather clear, actually, at a strategic level. It's about the long-term public interest, it's about the common good, and it's about the future well-being of communities. And if you can be open and honest with the public up front that all of this change that's coming in planning and infrastructure is actually for the long-term common good. Some of it you may not like in the short term, but we're talking about the long-term common good, delivering on climate, delivering sustainable development goals, and delivering for communities. We think it's really important that the opportunity is not missed to not only help inform the public and everybody else that needs to know as to what the purpose of planning is, but actually provides that North Star, that guiding star as to the why. Why are we doing this, and what for what purpose does it have? So we're absolutely clear, thank you for your question, that having a public purpose of planning is really important for this legislation, and we'll continue making that case. Thank you.
One more people questions. Minister.
Thank you, Chair. Two quick questions if I can. One on plan decisions to Victoria and then one on development corporations to Hugh. Victoria, you will know at the moment individual local planning authorities have schemes of delegation. It's great to get your take on how effective you think they are. What's the variation we see out there? What are the principles that should inform the national scheme of delegation that we intend to introduce via the bill? And on development corporations, Hugh, the bill provides for a clearer, more flexible and more robust framework for the operation of development corporations. You know that it's clearly our view that they've got to do a lot of work in the coming years to drive the kind of delivery we need and the types of development we want to see come forward. What's your assessment about how effective those powers are, those DevCorp powers are, to support development and regeneration?
Thank you very much, Minister, for the question. One of the things we know from our members, but also from those people who are actually in the business of building things, and of course that's really what's important if you want to see some growth coming, is consistency. And you asked about the variation. Some councils have fantastic schemes of delegation. It's very clear as to what's going to committee, what isn't going to committee. And other councils have a slightly more grey scheme of delegation, let's call it that, where things can pop up at committee on the basis of an individual issue or an individual councillor. And what the opportunity afforded by the bill gives us is the opportunity for some consistency of a national scheme of delegation. We have some very robust processes in place that look at the business of development through the local plan process, which doesn't go to one but two public inquiries through the government's inspectorate and then back to the community. And I think what we can recognise is if you've had some very robust considerations of the principles of development and you've got good development prescribed by, for example, design codes, it says this is what good development looks like here. So we've worked out what we want, we've worked out where it's going, and we've worked out what it looks like. I think it's perfectly possible that suitably qualified chief planning officers can work out whether or not something's in conformity with a plan, and therefore we welcome the opportunity for the clarity of that through a national scheme of delegation. This is not to take away anybody's democratic mandate to have their say. Of course, there's all sorts of opportunities to have that say in the local plan process. But we do think, though, however, Minister, that if we are going to move to a national scheme of delegation, we would want a statutory chief planning officer who has that statutory wraparound with that appropriate level of competency and also gravitas to be able to drive forward that change. Because it will be a change for some authorities, for some not at all. But to take forward that innovation via national scheme of delegation is going to require that statutory post so that those decisions cannot be challenged because they will be made in a professionally competent way.
Sorry, second question.
Thank you for that. I think development corporations are absolutely essential if we're going to achieve this mission. And you'd expect the TCPA to say to that because we're inheritors of the New Towns programme. But the interesting thing about them is that what they do is that they bolt together for the first time strategy and delivery. The existing town and country planning system is often blamed for not delivering homes, but it has no power to build them. The Development Corporation solves that problem by creating a delivery arm that can effectively deliver, well, in the New Towns programme, housing 2.8 million people in 32 places in less than 20 years of designation, which paid for itself. It's an extraordinary model. I think the measures that are in the bill to provide modernising overall duties on development corporations are really welcome. I probably assume you don't want me to talk about CPO right now, but obviously Hope Value and CPO are critical. Accompanying ideas in the reform package to go with that. So in the long run, I think they will become critical. Obviously, the New Towns Task Force has to decide what it wants to decide on policy. The only challenge we face around them, I think, is legitimacy, and there is still work to do in making sure there is a Rolls-Royce process of getting public consent for this new generation of places. But the outcome, what an opportunity it is to create places that genuinely enhance people's health, that deal with the climate crisis, that can provide high levels of affordability. And what a contrast that is from what we've delivered through town and country planning at local plan level, which is a lot of the bolt-on car-dependent development, which frankly as a planner I find shameful. So, you know, the opportunity I think with development corporations is there, and I hope the government seizes it.
Give your names.
Thank you, Mr. Twigg. Clause 46 is about delegating decisions, but it's delegating decisions away from elected councillors. So, and as Liberal Democrats, we oppose that. But I'll address the question to Dr. Hugh, Ellis, and the others may wish to jump in. I'm a planner, you're a planner. Perhaps all these decisions should be taken by planners. Would you like to respond?
I'm really, I mean, I'll be honest, as a planner, I'm really worried about it, because the one thing that's difficult is that you can't build without consent. And I think governance in planning is really important. Environmental governance in general is important. I'm sceptical about the degree to which this is a really big problem. I can see some evidence coming through to suggest that delegation rates for normal applications that you can decide locally is very high already. But the thing that worries me more than anything else is the fact that if you sideline that opportunity that people currently have, and I made this point earlier on, for things like an opportunity to be represented at committee as the public, the appearance, if not the intent, is that you're excluding people. You have to lean in periods of change. You must lean into consultation and participation and democratic accountability. And you must accept that while that isn't a veto, because you, as parliamentarians, may wish to decide that the development proceeds, but it's either democracy or it isn't. And for us, the idea of democratic planning is so central and was so important to 1947 that government had a choice. It had a land board, which it proposed could have made all the decisions centrally on planning, but it gave it to local government on the basis that people locally understand decision-making best. My own experience is that people are a solution, not a problem. And wherever I go, I find people who know detail about development, can improve development, particularly on flood risk, and want to contribute. And I don't accept that there is an anti-development, lobby everywhere, certainly not in my community. What there are is people concerned about quality, affordability, service provision, and their voice should be heard. And I think if this creates that impression, even if it's not the intent, that there is a sort of non-respectful conversation going on. Finally, as a planner, I would never want to be in the firing line for taking a decision on a major housing scheme that is ultimately a matter of politics and should always be so.
So, if I may respond as well on that, I think there is real merit actually in the delegation scheme that's being proposed. And it's done and within the confines of ensuring that the plan-making process is robust, that the engagement process is made by community representatives through the EIP process and other avenues that can help that plan-making take place. And if you get those processes in such a place where everyone has engaged in the plan, understand what's being delivered, and I've created neighbourhood plans as much as I've worked on regional spectral strategies and indeed the London plan, I know that if you can get that engagement from the outset with communities and communities buy in from that point, and then you see the follow-through of the consistency of the delivery of that, actually it's not a brave decision for a planning officer to make, because they're following the lines of what the community have charged them to go and deliver for them. So I think we have to remind ourselves that it's about cases where that devoid those policies and try to do something else, which is where it then needs a further democratic overview. But in the broadest sense, if we are looking at the growth that this country needs, if we are looking at the delivery that this country needs at the pace it needs it to be, we do need to think in a more dynamic fashion. And I think the delegation scheme does have merit. I take the point that Victoria makes about the chief officer. That does provide good cover, seniority in a council, to be able to provide that oversight to make sure that the themes that are required for the community are also delivered. So I think that working in tandem provides a real opportunity for a good national delegation scheme to come forward.
And I would just add to that, a professionally competent chartered town planner is very capable at ensuring that all of the community interests are represented and balanced, and driving really excellent outcomes. And certainly that's the business that our members are in, delivering great places.
Less than 10 minutes, so there's quite there's 7 at the last count wanted to ask questions. You can be very, very quick with your questions, so we're not going to get everybody in. Nestle Calixon.
Thank you very much, Chair. Panel members. I'd like to just dig down a bit on local plans, particularly building on Ms Hill's comments around the need for a chief planning officer. I've got 2 parts to my question. One is I wondered if you might be able to say something around the lack of capacity that exists in local authorities at the moment. It's all well and good having a chief planning officer, but planning and strategic planning doesn't depend on one person. It depends on a large team. And is there a comment you'd like to make about capacity? And further to that, my second is around local plans. Is strategic planning and growth being hindered by the fact that the majority of local areas do not have an up-to-date local plan?
Very briefly, capacity and capability has been a hindrance in local authorities now for a number of years. We've lost 25% of local authority planners alone in the last 7 years, and that can't continue. We're working with the department and many partners, public practice, pathways to planning, all really, really important at this moment in time. The chief planner is there to advocate for those resources at the top table of local government, to ensure that they've got a statutory basis on which to help retain the budget. But within this context, despite everything that everybody's doing to bring in more planners, and we're private sector money as well, working with the British Chamber of Commerce on a new planning scholarship using private sector money to solve the crisis of lack of capacity. Our biggest burning platform at the moment is the uncertainty regarding the Level 7 apprenticeship, with 60% of apprentices in local government coming from underrepresented groups within the profession. Unless we have urgent clarity soon as to whether or not our Chartered Town Planner apprenticeship can continue, we are seriously worried about the pipeline of planners going into local government. And so it would be remiss of me not to mention that in the context of your capacity question. On local plans, of course, it's not good enough that only 40% of local authorities have an up-to-date local plan. That is an urgent priority. Of those 25% of local authority planners who have left local government in the last 7 years, we suspect the lion's share of them are in those local planning teams. And we need to work urgently to put that capacity back in. The apprenticeship will go some way, so will pathways, so will the planning scholarship. But really there is no time to waste to ensure that we can put that capacity back in. We think that the statutory chief planning role will not only be have the right level of seniority to advocate for it, they will actually help restore planning departments as a real career choice for those graduates who are coming out of planning schools now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to make a few questions on, so local plans have been spoken about. Sorry, yes. We've spoken about local plans and outline planning permission, and I'll link those two together because it's sort of been alluded to that the fact people buy into that, there's lots of consultation around it, and of course the public buy into those processes because when development comes forward in those areas, it's like painted in gold. You've got all of the amenities, everything the residents want, it's all said, yeah, we can deliver all of that. And then when they come forward for full planning permission, it's completely changed. So the residents have bought into something that they want to buy in terms of the fantastic development that developers are proposing. And when they come for full planning, it's completely different. So they go up in arms. So they haven't really bought into that. What would you make some comments on the differentials between that?
Well, the outline, as you say, is an outline. Now, but the reality is any full application that's coming forward should be aligned with the requirements for the agreement for social infrastructure, or all the other elements that are required, whether it's the affordable housing, social infrastructure, civil payments, etc. So this is where planning should be taking, there was an early question, what is planning for? Well, planning is for that. to ensure that those community benefits are derived from development, to ensure that it's inclusive not just for new residents but existing residents as well. So I think that's a guardianship point of where the planning team or the local authority have to ensure that what they said they would like to see come forward from the plan is ultimately delivered. People will go into viability discussions and say, well, I can't afford that and I can't afford this. That's a judgment that has to be made about what can be delivered in the public interest as well. So in answer to your question, that's very much where planning sits at the fore, to ensure that the right development with the right social infrastructure comes forward that's fitting for the place it's sitting in.
Okay, Rachel Taylor.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I'd like to focus again on local planning authorities. I'm acutely aware in my constituency in North Warwickshire and Bedworth of the under-resourcing of planning authorities, and this bill enables us to charge increased fees. But I'm also aware of the frustration of local developers and businesses about the delays in the planning system. Do you think that the ability to charge extra fees will strike the right balance, and should they be ring-fenced to make sure that decisions are made in a timely manner?
We've been advocating for ring-fencing of fees since time began. It's absolutely essential, and we know, and I'm sure you'll pick this point up in a moment, Faraz, for your clients, I haven't met a single developer that's not willing to pay for more for a service. The problem is they're paying more and they're not getting the service. Some places they are, but not others. And so the opportunity through this bill to strengthen the ring fencing and ensure that the money stays within the planning team to deliver the service can't come soon enough to help reduce some of those delays. And having the opportunity for local areas to work out what good looks like for them is absolutely a sensible way forward within that. We do feel that, again, having the right level of seniority within the department to ensure that the money stays there is going to be a key part of it. So thank you, and sorry to you.
So now look, it's a hugely positive move to move towards this ring fencing idea within the planning service, and actually it may extend slightly when I say planning service to the legal side as well, because you have to get those Section 106 agreements signed off to make things happen. The key is, though, it has to stay ring fenced for that resource to happen. We often see PPAs, planning performance agreements, are paid up front for meetings, and that has a very uneven balance of how well those derived in terms of service that the clients receive when they pay those large chunks of change for that service. So developers are right, applicants are right that they can get frustrated that what they think they're doing is getting a premier service to help facilitate the direction of how they want to bring forward an application, and then find that actually it doesn't change the dial one iota. But I think actually the very basic premise of ensuring that let's just say the chief executive of the council or the finance director says, oh, I'll take that because I need to put it in social care or I need to put it in schools or education, but actually it stays there, because remember, if we keep that money inside the planning service, it will drive the growth that the government has set out it wants to achieve. So the devil's in the detail. We need to see that more, but it is the right direction to take.
Only to say that it will stabilise issues for development management, but policy officers that we work with, it doesn't necessarily support their work. And also a piece of heresy, if it's okay, which is the private sector complains a lot about delay, despite getting 86% of all its applications approved. And I think there needs to be more debate about competence in the private sector for this reason. When a private sector developer applies for a Category 3A floodplain development and then complains that the Environment Agency wants it to go through a process on flood risk assessment, my blood boils. Planners are doing life and death stuff. For example, no house built after 2009 is part of the insurance compact. If we get this wrong, we'll have negative equity, will look like a picnic. So planning is trying to do really complicated stuff, and it needs time to do that, and statutory consultees are crucial to that, and they need to be resourced properly to play that role as well.
We're now literally coming down to the last few seconds of this. So I'm going to call an end to this session. I'm sorry that we can get everybody in. So order, that brings us to the end of the time allocated for the committee to ask questions. I thank our witnesses on behalf of the committee for the evidence. We now move on. That's till 3:25, isn't it? Yeah. Right, we'll get going straight away. We now hear evidence from Jack Early, Director of Housing and Infrastructure for Public First, and Sam Richards, CEO of Britain Remade. This session will run to 3:25. Can I call the opposition spokesperson?
Thank you very much, Mr. Twigg, and welcome to the committee, Mr. Airey and Mr. Richards. Thank you for your time, and sorry to keep you waiting. I hope the questions are worth it. I'd just like to, as you know, our position as the opposition has been that we have been consistently concerned through the second reading debate. We asked some questions earlier to other witnesses about a perceived democratic deficit within the future planning system should some of these measures go through, particularly around national schemes of delegation and when it comes to statutory consultees and changes within the consultation process. I just wondered whether you, Mr. Airey, could give an oversight on your view on whether you think this piece of legislation removes local people's right to make representations and have an impact to the extent that they currently can on local planning decisions.
Thanks for the question. I think, well, first of all, we start from a very low base of democratic engagement in the planning system. Like, very few people engage in planning applications or the planning process, and often the people that do are not representative of their local area. I think the number one best thing we could do is to increase that participation and get a much wider range of people involved in like having a say in planning. So that's my primary concern. In terms of a national scheme of delegation, I mean, it all depends on the detail that is provided by the government later and how it's implemented through the regulations. I'm in the context I set out, I'm not too worried about a perceived loss of democratic oversight because I feel like it's so low, and I think it'd be remiss not to note that councillors who are on planning committees are often elected for very, very small mandates, you know, very, very low turnouts in local elections. So we start, in my view, from a very low position of kind of people having the right say in what they should be doing. In terms of the reform that comes forward, I think it would be no bad thing if the intent of the reform is to reduce the number of schemes that are rejected for nakedly political reasons by planning committees. It's no way to regulate a major part of our economy. The construction industry creates lots of uncertainty for developers, for communities. Ultimately, it means fewer things get built and much less growth happens than should do. Often also councils are losing millions of pounds, fighting, having to fight appeals that a developer is bound to win because they put forward a scheme that is compliant with a local plan, and again it's been rejected for reasons that are quite odd in my view a lot of the time. So if the reform the government eventually brings forward begins to deal with that, I think it'd be very worthwhile, but the threshold for delegation will have to be set in a way which just removes as much ambiguity as possible, so that planning officers, they don't always feel the need to direct every single application to a committee because every application will be controversial to someone.
Thank you. May I suggest you're a very brave man to talk about the democratic eligibility of councillors when you're sitting in front of a committee full of them, or former ones, but there we go, that's your rodeo. Can I just ask you a further question, which is the role of planning committees? So what do you think of the proposal put forward by the RTPI, which looked at a proposal for a chief planning officer to strengthen those, not democratic accountability, but that officer accountability to ensure and tackle some of your perceived drawbacks within the system, i.e. the number being referred to committee, the number that are being challenged unfairly? Do you think there's any advantages in that in the system going forward?
There's certainly a capacity problem in planning committees. Every part of the system is saying that, so it's going to, I think, in my view, it must be pretty true. So does that proposal deal with that directly? I'm not sure. As someone else, I think another question was around, like, do we need different levels of planning officers, or do we need a chief statutory planning officer? I don't know. I think that is the number one issue. I'm not sure. I'm not being quite neutral on their proposal because I'm not sure it solves that issue, but it's definitely a capacity issue. And I would them being statutory mean that they get more funding in the council? I don't know. I think councils are a bit more complicated than that sometimes.
Thank you.
Chair, you both worked for the previous governments in different incarnations, one on housing and the other on climate and the environment. And I just wondered whether there are things contained in this bill that you would have argued for then that didn't maybe didn't happen under the government, under the previous government, and whether there were any areas where you would indeed go further. Does this deliver on the need to build more homes, get the growth that we need, and while also protecting the environment?
Shall I go first?
Yeah.
So, for those who don't know, Britain Remade is a campaign, 35,000 people across the country supporting us building the homes, the energy and the transport infrastructure we need. And it's worth briefly just stepping back and remembering why we do desperately need to streamline the planning system. I'm going to give you 4 quick examples. So, number 1, the Lower Thames Crossing, the planning application for the Lower Thames Crossing, I see the member here. The planning application for the Lower Thames Crossing has cost more than £250 million. That is more than it cost Norway to actually build the world's longest tunnel. That's been all in planning, that's all paperwork, not a single spade in the ground. Example 2. HS2 is the world's most expensive railway line. And why is that? Well, in no small part, it's because we're doing things like building a £121 million back tunnel to protect 100 Bechstein bats, or 300 Bechstein bats that live in a nearby wood. Not actually the wood that the line goes through, but a nearby wood, which I think most people would agree is a disproportionate response. Example 3. We are currently building the world's most expensive nuclear power plant at Hinkley. It is indeed the most expensive nuclear power plant ever constructed in the history of the human race. Why is it so expensive? We used to build them cheaper. 20 years ago, they were half the price. When we built the fleets in the 50s and 60s, they're a quarter of the cost of the ones that we're building now. Why is it costing so much more? Well, in no small part, it's to do with the environmental rules that mean that we are currently, well, EDF are currently wrangling with regulators and have been doing for 8 years about installing an underwater fish disco, an acoustic deterrent to stop the fish from swimming into the exhaust pipes of the power plant. Millions of pounds is currently being spent on this. And example number 4, the planning application for a railway line between Bristol and Portishead, 3.3 miles, reopening an existing line that was cut in the Beeching Cuts, is 80,000 pages long, with over 1,000 pages dedicated to bats on what is already existing lines. So it's important to make that point because the ambition of this bill is absolutely right. We need to make it much easier to build the homes, the energy and the transport links that we need. And in many ways, what the government is setting out to do, they are delivering on. But I think that there is one crucial area where they are going to need to go further, and that is on the changes to the application of the habitats regulations. And it's worth saying as well, while we're failing to build, we're failing to protect nature, all of our key biodiversity indicators are in decline. So the shift to a strategic approach to environmental protections is absolutely the right one. It's getting away from this site-by-site approach that has led to the bat tunnels and the fish discos is absolutely the right one. We need it both to help us build the stuff quicker and also to help us better protect nature. But my fear with the way that the bill is currently written, and we may come on to more details about the EDPs, but the way that they are going to be brought in and implemented means that because the habitats rules remain untouched and sit underneath them, that if EDPs are not brought in, then the habitats rules kick in as they do currently. It obviously relies on Natural England bringing out all of these EDPs, and indeed those EDPs working for species. It's easy to see how they will apply in the case of, say, nutrient neutrality. And we've basically already started doing that with the nutrient mitigation schemes, I think they're called, that started 2 years ago. And that's all to the good, and that should unlock lots of house building in the south of England. That's brilliant. But I do fear that as things currently stand, the government has not solved the bat tunnel issue, and I think it's that they're going to need to come back to.
Just anything you want to add, Jack?
Does it deliver more homes and infrastructure? I think it's also almost an unfair question because legislative reforms to the planning system, they take so long to have an effect. And while a lot of the things in the bill are very positive, they're going to improve the structure of the planning system. It will take a long time for them to have an effect. It will take a long time for the various bits of regulations to be laid. I worked on the Levelling Up Act. There's so much of that bill that it hasn't been implemented, probably won't ever be implemented, and I fear maybe we'll be in a situation with this bill too. The reforms the government has brought forward in the National Planning Policy Framework are much more, dare I say, radical and probably impactful, certainly in the short to medium term. Ditto forthcoming reforms to the National Development Management Policies, if they are got right and done the right way. So it's actually through policy changes that the department does that you have a quicker effect, and where I'd be looking to that in the short term. In terms of where it go further, I would agree with Sam on that part of the bill. If you are a government that wants to deliver a lot of homes very quickly, I'm not sure this is the reform I would have brought forward. I would have looked again at the reform that was put forward by the previous government, which would have disapplied habitats regulations when it relates to nutrient neutrality requirements in a way that just totally disapplied them. So there'd be no need to produce an EDP. There'd be no need for the developer to pay a levy. That would have been the quickest way to unblock the homes that are currently stalled by this issue at the moment.
Thank you, Mr. Twigg. Very interesting analysis. You touched on Hinckley, close to my constituency. I suppose I just want to drill down a little bit more into where you see the delays in the planning system, because all the examples you mentioned were delivered within the 6 months examination. But the points you raised were about species. So you mentioned bats, you mentioned fish. It's really those species protections that are really holding things up, isn't it? Is that your view?
So that is, as I said, that is what I think the big gap in the bill is. I mean, there's a range of things, right? There's the rounds and rounds of consultations, which the government has actually made some good progress on just this week, and it's to the announcement to reduce the pre-application consultation stages. That's to be welcomed. It's the rounds and rounds of judicial reviews, and the fact that the vast majority of major infrastructure projects in this country are brought to the courts, and this has been the case multiple times for Hinckley, and will be the case for Sizewell. And so, again, what the government has done there is welcome to reduce the opportunity for vexatious judicial reviews and reducing the number of opportunities down from 3 to kind of 1.5. That's to be welcome. But, yes, it is also the additional environmental mitigations that has to be brought, and the disproportionate responses that add costs and delay to building major infrastructure.
And from Liberal Democrats, we have sympathy for a lot of the measures in the bill for speeding up. Just to come back to the species, I've just checked. So removing the fish disco, which is famous feature of the Hinckley development, that will cost about 3 million fish a year. Is that expendable species? Is it? Does it not matter?
So I think the key point here is not just the sort of do that particular species matter, but the mitigation measures that developers are able and allowed to take under the current framework. So I know that EDF proposed, and I'm not here to represent EDF, but I know that they proposed that you could basically pay a fishing vessel to not fish in a similar area with a similar species, that would then allow the replenishment of stocks of an equivalent amount. But under the current rules, you're not able to do that strategic level mitigation.
I'll leave it there.
Jim Dixon. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Twigg. In my constituency of Dartford, very many new homes have been built over the past decade. Unfortunately, residents believe, and I think it's undoubtedly the case, that this has put a huge strain on local infrastructure, which hasn't kept pace. Do you feel that this bill provides the opportunity to ensure that we do have the right infrastructure as we build the many more homes that are going to be built in Dartford and also other parts of the country over the next period? So the medical facilities, the schools, the affordable homes, do you feel that the bill gives us the right framework in order to ensure that happens, unlike what's happened previously around infrastructure and homes being built together?
I mean, the existing framework for doing that, the Section 106 system, the community infrastructure levy system, I'm not sure if it applies in Dartford or not, but still. But I mean, that in my mind provides a fairly effective way of doing this in a way that doesn't make development totally unviable, while also kind of extracting enough value in the way that provides some contribution to the community. So I don't think there's anything in the bill that really kind of focuses on this, or I can be proven wrong. But I think the existing system works okay. It's really difficult to do this, and it doesn't always work, and communities always rightly want the right amount of infrastructure. But I guess this might relate to my other comments I might make, is we rely on the planning system to do so much heavy lifting to deliver all sorts of things that everyone wants, and we try to prioritise everything and end up prioritising nothing. So we could have a system that relied entirely, where we did extract more from developer contributions that went to community infrastructure, but that would come at a trade-off probably around provision of affordable housing and other things like that. I think that would be a sensible debate to have if that is what your constituents want, but it's also quite difficult politically.
David Simmons.
Thank you. Mr. Twigg, worth noting that less than 1 in 10 planning applications goes to committee at all. So it's hard to argue that it's a particularly heavy democratic burden, but one of the things we have heard is burdensome in the evidence earlier on today is the pre-application process. And we're very interested in your view about what can be done to ensure that there is meaningful and useful pre-application discussion. And in particular, I'm mindful of the Minister's amendment today, I think it was, or maybe yesterday, on nationally significant infrastructure projects, which removes quite a number of the requirements around consultation. Now, particularly from some of the large energy infrastructure projects, they described having large pipelines of potential projects, some of which were very speculative, others of which were quite close to the sort of spades in the ground stage. So how can we ensure that what emerges from this bill guarantees meaningful and proper consultation so that the receiving community really understands what the impact is going to be, and also so, where there may be local objections, people have a really detailed understanding of what the benefits are going to be in order to persuade them to be more supportive of those proposals.
TIP or TCPA as well?
I think it covers both, but I think each of those things is addressed separately in this bill.
Yeah. In terms of, it goes back to my initial point around community participation in the planning process is so low, and so you often only hear about the negative part. So if we could just boost that a bit, how you do that in a way that isn't totally burdensome on local authorities, I'm not totally sure in truth, because often people have got better things to do than go to a town hall on Tuesday evening. And so raising that is a difficult thing, but a necessary thing to do. I think that is how you begin to spell out the benefit, not just the negatives, but the benefits of development on the local planning system side. On the NSIP reforms, I mean, I know you've got Catherine Howard here later, who is much more of an expert on this than I am, and it looks like a wholly positive thing to me. And the government press release talked about saving, I think it was around 12 months of a NSIP DCO process, which is a hugely positive thing.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Jack. I mean, dare I say it, I think that there is a role here for elected representatives as well in making the case when we need to build things. And I know it's hard, not least when development is poorly planned or ugly. And of course, when there is local opposition, it is often tempting to row a number on the side of those who are opposing development. But there is a job here to do. We fundamentally have not built sufficient infrastructure for decades, and as a result have the highest industrial energy costs in the world. London has the most expensive housing in Europe. We have not built the infrastructure we needed for decades, and there's a job that is incumbent on all of us, and that includes our elected representatives in making the case for the building that we need.
Thank you. In my constituency of Portsmouth North, we've had very few homes being built in the last decade. And today, Sam, you've highlighted how previous governments have failed catastrophically, really, with taxpayers' money in time and in money that's been put into planning and development across the country. And Jack, you've said the existing system is okay. So is okay enough for my constituents like mine who do need houses and homes and communities and have natural environments around them?
system for securing and spending developer contributions is okay. I don't think the wider planning system is okay. In terms of how you can improve it, I think a lot of the measures in the bill are very worthwhile, and I think a lot of the changes in the MPPF are incredibly worthwhile to do. And there are much more things government could do on, especially the national development management policies.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the system is fundamentally broken. I'm sure your constituents are furious that their energy bills are through the roof and they can't afford the rent, and they're right to be so.
Lewis Cocking.
I just want to come back to something you said at the beginning, Jack, around, and I probably should say I'm still a local councillor till the 1st of May. You basically said that no one engages with the planning system, or public constituents don't engage with that. But what evidence have you got to suggest that? Because I would slightly push back on that, and I just think that was a big sweeping statement. So I just want to understand what evidence you've got to back that up.
I do. Well, where I work, Public First, we do lots of opinion research. We do public opinion. We do public polling. We do focus groups. We do something we call immersives, and we go and speak to them and ask them what they think about things. And we, some polling we've done. We ask them, have you engaged in planning applications? Do you get involved with the local plan? It's like minuscule proportions of people. And we go and speak to people about developments that are happening, and we often find there is definitely opposition to development, and it is often very intense. And if you're listening to debates in the building across the road, or if you look online, often it looks like it's totally representative of the local community. But often if you go on the ground and speak to people, most people do not care about it. They might even support it. While there is some opposition, and I'm sure you hear it a lot in your constituencies, and when you go doorstep to doorstep, it's just much smaller than it seems. And that is the message I was trying to give, and it's engaging those people who need to be housed, if we're talking about housing, just as much as the people who oppose development, that we should talk to a bit more.
I don't agree, but no question.
I know, so people ask questions on your picture.
Practice that is out there, where in the system would you think is the best place to engage, though, with those local voices and have those local voices heard?
Do you mean where geographically?
No, where within the planning process, the end-to-end?
I think the emphasis of the bill, the bill put much greater emphasis on local plan making. In my view, that's a really good thing. We need plans that really stand up to scrutiny and that have homes that are promised to them that are actually delivered. So PINS has a big role there, and I think that is where most engagement should happen. At the moment, various people have many bites of the cherry to kind of give their view on development. Often it is a negative thing, sometimes it's a positive thing. And if that could be concentrated a bit more on the plan making process, where you have a site that is, once a site is allocated in a local plan, in my view it should be much harder for then that thing not to happen.
Thank you. What about you, Sam?
I agree with Jack.
Okay, thank you.
Well, Rachel, tell you, we can do this very, very quickly. You've got about a minute and a half, and maybe get a quick answer.
I'm just really interested to hear your quite controversial views on the role of local councillors in the planning process, and I'm sure that a lot of developers may agree with you. But I think we heard from the previous panel that planning with consent is key to securing good communities. So I think I'd like to ask Sam and you, Jack, a little bit further. How do you feel it is best, therefore, to consult with the public? Should it be via their elected representatives, or should there be something else within that local planning framework to do so?
I think this has been more Jack's point than mine, so I'll let him come back to it. But I think it is reasonable that is handled through the local plan. That's all I'm going to say.
Sorry, another controversial opinion. I don't think development necessarily has to have consent. There's lots of development that happens that doesn't have consent. Things that go through the permitted development regime. I lived in a home that was through the PDR regime. It's perfectly nice. It was really nice. You see lots of homes that are built this way. There is very little democratic, in fact, no democratic engagement, because MPs grant national planning permission for that through the general permitted development order. So I would just question the point that even though I get what people are saying, I'm not trying to question it entirely. Like, you can have nice homes that are delivered outside of that system. On your second question around should it be representatives, I think the most important thing is you go and ask people what they think.
That brings us to the end of the allotted time for questions to be asked by members. Can I thank the panel for their time? And can we change panels, please? This session will run to 10 to 4. So we now have evidence from Rachel Hallos, Vice President of the National Farmers Union, Paul Miner, Head of Policy at CPRE. As I say, we'll start the questions with the opposition spokesperson.
Thank you, Mr. Twigg. Thank you, Mr. Twigg. And welcome Rachel and Paul to the committee. And we look forward to questioning you and welcome you, and thank you for the work that you do. And can I thank you, Rachel, as well, for the work that the NFU has done over the past few months, of course longer term, but over the past few months with some of the challenges that farmers across the country are going through because of the government's policies. In that vein, may I ask you about a relatively controversial part of the legislation, which is compulsory purchase orders, and the proposals of the government to reform some of the CPO powers within the legislation that's being proposed. And of course there will be amendments going down through the process from the opposition. But can I ask you firstly, I'll ask all of the questions, because I know there's other members that want to come in, so I'll ask you both and then I'll shut up, much to the pleasure of others. But what would be the cumulative impact of these proposals on top of some of the proposals that have been brought in by the government, particularly in its autumn budget? And can you outline some of the representations you have had from your members about what the detailed reforms would be on the level of payments to people, whether tenant farmers or landowning farmers, on CPOs under the provision of this bill? And can I ask you, Mr. Milner, after, and thank you for being here, in terms of nature restoration and the NRFs, does your organisation have a concern that even though the government claims that there will be no net loss to environmental impacts out of this legislation, that unwillingly there would be a patchwork quilt effect created, where some areas would essentially have a deterioration in their environmental outcomes compared to other areas in the country? And could you give us a general view of your organisation's points on the Nature Restoration Fund in particular? Firstly, NFU.
Thank you very much for your question, and it's a very big question and a very big concern with our members. Just for the panel, as an organisation, we absolutely welcome measures to modernise the planning system. We all know it needs to happen. We all know that we need to build. We all know that we need to grow, and our industry also needs to grow. So I just wanted to make that very, very clear to the committee that we are in no way saying this is a bad idea. We see parts of this bill that we like. We see parts of this bill that we dislike. And I don't think it will come to any surprise to any of you that the compulsory purchase element of this bill is the one that has raised most concern with our members. In particular, last week when we brought our council members together who represent the 44,000 people that we have across England and Wales, this was the one that's really got them concerned. And I completely understand why when we see what's happened in the past, and is still ongoing with matters like HS2 and other things that's happened around the country. I think if we can break the compulsory purchase order element down into two different things. First of all, hope value. This is of real concern to our members. They completely understand that we need to build, we need to grow, we need infrastructure in place because we are woefully behind with it. When you go to somebody's home business and lay down the order that you're going to compulsory purchase it, there has to be fair reward to that person to actually enable them to rebuild their business, their home elsewhere. There's not a lot we can do about it. This is something that can happen to them that is completely out of their control. And I genuinely believe, and my members genuinely believe that if there is somebody that is going to make commercial gain out of compulsory purchasing that land, and perhaps potentially purchase some of it, making the rest of the business unviable, then the person that is having the purchase order served on them should also be commercially rewarded, so they can then continue, rebuild their life, rebuild their business in another place. And I think that's really important that we have that fairness there with the compulsory purchase orders. The second element, which is the one that really did send shivers, is giving Natural England the power to compulsory purchase land. For all the reasons I've been sat at the back, and I've already heard Pat's mentioned, we really do not believe the committee should vote for this clause as part of this bill. When the government has provided so little explanation as to why it should be there, we are very concerned about giving Natural England compulsory purchase responsibilities and ability to do that. And it's not just because of back tunnels. It's about, there's another layer that sits behind that. This is about, so you can put environmental goods on hold over there whilst you build something, but you recreate it over there. Wildlife biodiversity doesn't have borders, it doesn't have boundaries, it is amongst us. And it might come strange to you as a farming representative to talk like that, but we genuinely believe that we can deliver food security, you know, the good old line, food security is national security, at the same time as enhancing, protecting, whichever way you want to call it, the environment. And I think we need to be really, really careful that we ensure that whoever has the powers to compulsory purchase land, if that is really the route you want to go down, that they have the capabilities, the capacity to do it in the right manner so that there aren't losses. That is where our members are. I fully support their stance on that, and we feel very, very strongly about it.
Thank you. It's illuminating, and we'll take that forward in the process of this committee stage of the legislation. Sorry, I did say it, called you Miller. Mr. Minor, sorry, I apologise. Could you just elaborate on some of the questions around, or my one question around the NRF element of the legislation, please?
Thank you very much. We had concerns about biodiversity net gain when it was introduced, because we didn't feel that it was going to lever in as much resources for nature conservation as some of its proponents were claiming, and also that it wouldn't necessarily be delivering strategic benefits. So on that basis, we do actually support the principle of a nature restoration fund as being something that will has the potential to take a more strategic approach. And from our perspective, it's particularly important that the Nature Restoration Fund links well with the government's proposed land use framework, which we also support and which we urge the government to bring in as soon as possible after the consultation finishes. And there should also be strong links between the Nature Restoration Fund and the local priorities that are identified in local nature recovery strategies. We do have concerns about the detail that's being proposed in the bill, and in particular about the potential compromising of the well-established mitigation hierarchy, so the principle that you should avoid environmental damage before seeking to compensate or mitigate for it. And we're also members of Wildlife Countryside Link, who you'll hear from later on, and we support what they've been saying about the Nature Restoration Fund.
Thank you very much. No further questions.
Right, then can I call on Clewer, please?
Thank you, Mr. Twigg. One of the challenges in planning is finding that optimum balance between housing, environmental requirements, food production, and local decision-making and consultation. Do you feel that the government's proposed bill strikes a fair balance between those four things?
No.
Please expand.
I will expand. I am not convinced that there is clarity as to how the balance has been put there, the calculations, the balance, if you take such land out of production, what imbalance does that create with production elsewhere? If you move environmental goods from one area of land onto another area of land. What is the imbalance that's being created there? If we're going to go down an accounting route, what's the cost benefit of doing it? Whether it's food production, whether it's homes, whether it's environment. I'm not sure that that's in there, and I think that needs to be in there to make sure that the right decisions are being taken in the right places. As an organisation and representing farmers, and as a farmer myself, I know that what we do on our land is a long process. Whether it's producing food, whether it's managing the land for environmental goods. This is not a quick fix. We can't change a dial and something change overnight. So I think we need to make sure that the right decisions are being taken in the right places. And we also need to recompense the people that are taken along with it as they go.
We would probably agree with what Rachel's saying. We think overall the bill does need to strike a better balance between the various objectives that the planning system seeks to fulfil. In particular, it's not just about facilitating development, it's also about mitigating and adapting to climate change. It's also about helping to secure nature recovery. And we think there is more that can be done on the face of the bill to give the wider public and ourselves confidence that in the future we're going to get better plans and decisions that will look to achieve a vision around getting more sustainable development, around achieving our climate change targets, and also achieving our very ambitious nature conservation targets as well. I think one element that hasn't really come up in questioning so far, but one that we're particularly keen to raise is about clause 22 of the bill around householder payments on electricity transmission lines. We don't think that making payments to householders is really the way to go. What we should really focus on instead is building on the good practice that we already have for onshore wind farms, whereby we consult and involve communities in community benefit schemes, and also look to achieve community benefit schemes that help communities in turn address climate change, and also get more rooftop solar on people's homes in rural areas, improve the energy efficiency of rural housing. It just seems to us that giving payments to householders completely goes against working in any kind of public interest, and we would urge parliamentarians to look again at that clause in the bill.
David Simmons.
Thank you very much, Mr. Twigg. I just want to ask you both about the interaction between Greenbelt and farming areas, particularly in a constituency like mine, not on the edge of London, but a lot of edge-of-city constituencies. There is land that is both in the Greenbelt and is also farmland. Now, that has significant implications for the landowner because the hope value on it is significantly higher than farmland might be elsewhere. But it also has that need for additional protection because it is ancillary to the existence of the city. It provides sometimes a source of food, leisure, as well as the environmental benefits of it being green spaces. So just interested in your view about whether the bill sufficiently addresses the balance between Greenbelt and agricultural use, and what improvements you might want to see around compulsory purchase processes to ensure that landowners in locations like that have appropriate recourse, and also where it is clear that the land in question provides a broader public benefit as opposed to simply a business standing on its own, that broader public benefit can be accounted for in the reckoning up of the value of that land.
Do you want to go? Right, okay. It's almost like having ransom strips next to urban conurbations, isn't it? And that green belt gets sucked into that urban conurbation, and then all of a sudden it becomes a brown belt. And I think the words grey belt was considered at one stage as well. The reality is that when you are in that situation, I can completely understand, though some of my members would not, and that's the leadership role that we have to take, that land is of national benefit for planning for development, because it increases the size of the town, etc., the infrastructure, the whole thing. I think The bill needs to, again, it goes back to doing the number crunching. What is the benefit? What is the long-term benefit for this? And we've also got to remember as well that when we actually compulsory purchase land from a farmer who's running their business and living there, they have every right to make a decision to actually restart their business elsewhere. If that land value goes up and they're being paid just the flat agricultural rates, and everybody wants that land, because guess what, everybody wants land right now. Everybody wants land for everything. So land prices are creeping up anyway. It then actually artificially inflates the land price in that area because everybody's after it. So that's the bit that needs to be taken into consideration as well when it comes to recompensing anybody that has land taken away from them. And I think the bill is a complicated formula, but the bill really does need to look at that. If we are going to go anywhere near rebuilding that confidence and that trust within the agricultural community and government, especially when if you put it in the package of everything else that is going on, we are very much in danger of having this bang again, and this has got to stop. This has got to stop. We've all got to get on with life. We've all got to get on with what it is that we do, produce food, infrastructure, growth for the country.
Greenbelt is a planning policy, but as you've rightly pointed out, Greenbelt land often has a wide range of public benefits and meanings for people who live in the towns and cities that the Greenbelt surround. And from our perspective, we strongly support the bill's provision for spatial development strategies, because you do need effective strategic planning for Greenbelt policy to work effectively. But also from our perspective, it needs to be the case that we shouldn't just be looking at how the planning policy should work. We should also be looking at, if we accept that the vast majority of Greenbelt land won't become grey belts in future but will remain designated Greenbelts, then we need to think about how we can better manage that land. And that's why it's really important that in spatial development strategies and in the government's land use framework as well, we have policies for improving the management of Greenbelt land, because up until now, Greenbelt land's been relatively poorly served by successive governments' environmental land management schemes. There's relatively low take-up in Greenbelt areas, and we would urge the government, as part of the land use framework, but also with spatial development strategies as well, to seek to improve the quality of greenbelts for nature and for climate.
Can I just add one last thing to that? Sorry to be rude. But when it comes to that spatial development strategies and LNRSs and all those different things that are going on at the moment, that are consulting at the moment, there's actually no legal requirement to consult the land manager. That worries me. That's wrong. It's just wrong. Sorry.
Thank you, Chair. Rachel, can I press you on CPO, because you've raised some sort of very stark and serious concerns.
Yes.
Could you perhaps outline for the committee what you understand the CPO reforms in the bill to do? And specifically, can I ask you whether you accept that we are, through the bill, not changing the core principles of compulsory purchase, and that when it comes to removing hope value by directions, this bill is merely extending an existing power introduced by the previous government and extending that to town and parish councils. So what's the great fear about what we're doing on CPO through this legislation?
I think it's bigger than just this bill. It's CPO. It's a mistrust. It's a concern that people aren't taking food production, agriculture seriously. I think that's what it's encapsulated in. But the CPO element for me is people have felt the pain through CPO, badly delivered CPO through HS2 in particular. There are other things as well that have gone on in this country, and that has lingered really heavily. So you start mentioning compulsory purchase to any land manager, landowner, then it sends shivers down their spine. And the concerns that we have is that the impact of disregarding a hope value for landowners and farmers puts them in that tailspin again. So where do we go from here? How do we deal with this? And often we've found, especially with some of our members, and I will keep referring to HS2 because it has been an absolute nightmare, and it's still a nightmare. They are still waiting for that final agreed payment on many, many cases, so they can start getting on with their life. And I think that's the concern when it comes to the hope value. If you want to talk about...
So if I've understood you correctly, just to pull you up on that, if I've understood you correctly, it's a general dislike of CPO, a general objection to the powers introduced in the previous government bill, but nothing very specific about what's in this legislation.
It's the fact that there is potential that they will not get paid the true value of that land, of that farm. That's the concern.
And in some cases, astronomical values, yeah?
I mean, ultimately, you've got somebody that it's their life, it's their livelihood. And if they're only going to get paid the basic agricultural value out of no fault of their own, and they've got to start up elsewhere, and this is going to not just happen once or twice. If we actually follow down the huge infrastructure plans that the country actually needs, and we all know it needs, we accept this as a union that we need to grow, this will inflate land prices elsewhere as people choose to continue their livelihoods elsewhere and go looking for that land. That's the difference.
That's very useful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think if I can come back again, I know you're under the cosh at the moment, but
it's fine.
But
that's why
by the way, don't apologise because you're perfectly entitled, as every other witness is, to say your view on this piece of legislation. I would, however, say that I believe that the Minister is absolutely correct that there were some hope value reforms under the last government, and you know, I wasn't here, so not me.
Accept that.
But I think the Minister is being slightly disingenuous in terms of the reforms that are being proposed by the government in compulsory purchase order. You at no point stated that you are simply just uncomfortable with the concept of CPO. Could you outline some of the concerns that you have, perhaps, in terms of where the government are amending the rates at which tenant farmers and landowning farmers are being compensated? And what impact will that have on your members, particularly when the rate at which some people are being compensated under future legislation is due to reduce?
I'm a tenant farmer. My landlord can do as they wish. I have, in reality, I have few rights, so I understand what it's like to be a tenant farmer. So if this will change the relationship between a landlord and a tenant, then you've got a very difficult situation. And of course the tenant will only have a certain pool of money to take with them elsewhere to go and rent another farm. And as we all know, there's not a lot of them there. That will be the difference. It's the practical differences that I'm looking at here. I'm putting my farmer head on that says, if that happened to us on our farm, where would we go? What would we go with? And we would be in a competitive market trying to get that farm to continue to do what we do, which is produce food. And as many of you may know, not all farms are the same. So it's... If that's the farmer answer to you. I'm putting myself in those shoes.
Perfectly reasonable answer. Thank you, Chairman.
We have less than, just over a minute and a half. So, Luke Murphy, very quick question, a quick answer. We might just get something in.
Thank you very much. Rachel, I'm going to push again on hope value. You used the phrase through no fault of their own, but isn't that kind of the point about reforms of hope value? Is because hope value comes about through the granting of planning permission, which usually comes about because of a public infrastructure investment, a tube station, a train station, which inflates the value of the land. Now, known left-wingers such as Winston Churchill and Adam Smith advocated these kind of reforms, actually, back in the day, because it was through no genuine work through which that appreciation had come about. Is there not some merit, therefore, to reforming it?
I think there is merit to reforming it. It's making sure the reforms are in the right way. And fair to everybody. I have this line that, like I say, I think I've already said it. If somebody's going to benefit commercially from that purchase, then the person that's actually being compulsory purchased should also benefit too, and enable them to have adequate funding to be able to go and continue elsewhere.
Order. That brings us to the end of the time allocated for committee members to ask questions. Can I, on behalf of committee, thank the panel for their contribution and answers to the questions. We now change over to the next panel, please. Okay, we'll now hear evidence from Councillor Adam Hook, Chair of the Local Government Association's Local Infrastructure and Net Zero Board and Leader of Westminster City Council. Councillor Richard Dewar, Leader of Wiltshire Council and Housing and Planning Spokesperson for the County Councils Network. Councillor Richard Wright, Leader of Kesteven District Council and Planning Lead for District Councils Network. We have until 4:25 for this session. David, Opposition Spokesman Paul Holmes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Twigg, and thank you, councillors, for being here. Can I put on record that many members of this committee are serving councillors still and former councillors, and despite some of the words of earlier witnesses about the democratic mandate of councillors, including the chair, I respect what you do, so thank you very much. Can I, firstly, I would like to ask two mainstream questions. Firstly, around some of the government's wider reforms, which in some cases the opposition welcome, particularly around local government reform and the advent of new mayoralties, to combined authority mayoralties. Could I just gain your individual view on whether you think that undertaking a huge amount of work in terms of planning reform should come before we have seen the advancement of the reforms under LGR and mayoralties? And do you see that in any area of the legislation, are you concerned that some of the intended consequences of the planning reforms will not be able to be delivered as they should be because we haven't got the reforms to local government, which will fundamentally impact outcomes in the longer term? Could we go for you, Councillor, at the end first, and we'll work our way through?
So, I mean, I think obviously the government is trying to do multiple things at once, and that, I mean, that's the case for all governments at all times on all things. I think that the world doesn't stand still. So I think the challenge, obviously, for this piece of legislation and everything else is to try and build in the scope to evolve once the overall picture of local government reform is complete, and there is quite some way to go on that in different parts of the country. Speaking from part of the country that isn't currently in that round of discussions yet. I think what I would say is, I think at the heart of it that there has, the local plan has an important role, and we want to make sure that in any sort of new strategic setup that is created, that role of the local plan and the local councils having a say at whatever sort of core tier there is of local government, that has the ability to work with the new strategic mayoral authority in a collaborative and productive way, so that both tiers are working in partnership with, clearly recognise that new role is being brought in by the government, but recognising the importance of local councils and local communities who understand how to meet some of those strategic objectives in an effective way at a local level. So it's making sure that we're looking to build a partnership approach through any local government reform and how that then impacts on the planning agenda.
Thank you, Councillor Hugh. I understand. I know that as Leader of Westminster, you've been through your reform many years ago with the in terms of accountability reforms with the advance of the GLA. But I'm particularly interested in on the views of the district councils and county councils in terms of where we are now in potentially going through some reform in LGR. Are you worried about some of the outcomes of the legislation where we haven't got the reforms through yet in LGR?
Yes, completely. You always live in hope. I mean, I've sat on planning for 18 years before anybody wants to have a go at planning committee members.
It's your fault,
so I've lived in hope that we get clarity of purpose and clarity of policy. And at the moment, we've got far too many policies all coming through at the same time. So just for instance, the conflict between LGR, spatial development plans, it's chicken and egg. It seems to have come at the wrong time. Where I've spent the last few months explaining to residents that, because of the huge conflagration of policies at the moment, we've got policies that we won't think will actually achieve what they should do. For instance, I refer to the 1.5 million permissions that are going to be put in place, because there's not a single tool in any of what we've seen so far that will actually compel builders to build. So we've got that on one side. I'm now able to explain to people that alongside that, they'll no longer have a voice in the planning system if some of these policies go through. And this is all being swallowed up, and perhaps the attention of some people in the local authority could rightly be on local government reform and devolution, when really we need to see this in the round. And there's so many policies coming through, and conflicting policies, and policies that we think are only part finished, and some of them could actually achieve a lot of what we actually want to see and do, and for our residents to see. But at the moment, it's such a hodgepodge that it's very difficult to follow and to see where the concentration needs to be.
Thank you. Very briefly from the districts, then I'll come on to another question.
Sorry, from the county's point of view. I think you're raising some really valid points here. Having been through unitarisation, it's extremely disruptive. And for districts and county that are going through that and creating new authorities, you're placing an awful lot on them to then look at planning reform of this level of significance. Planning was one of the hardest areas to get into the new unitaries. We still struggle with it, 16 years on. It's proved really challenging because of that really local, granular impact that planning has. If you then want to look at the issue around the spatial plans, when some of us don't have mayors or don't even have mayoral geographies, I have no idea how we're meant to be talking with equal voices to create spatial delivery plans when we've got that hodgepodge. At the very least, we have to know our mayoral geographies to be able to make any headway in coming up with a meaningful plan. And honestly, without the mayors there and the authority and the funding and the voice that comes with them to central government, it's going to put everyone else at risk. And that really does concern me. It creates the ability for development to be pushed by mayors, perhaps in metropolitan areas, into more rural areas where the rural area doesn't have the voice and the same ability to express their challenges and their concerns. And you need the granularity to understand the impact of planning on that local level.
Thank you. I come from a school of thought that thinks that local authorities generally and genuinely try to do the right things for their local residents and start with trying to deliver change. If we take a look at the Minister's amendment, new clause 44, which are application for development consent, removal of certain pre-application requirements. Could you each, in the remits that you have, outline some of the concerns that you have around removing some of the pre-application requirements, what the impact might be on your workforce who are trying to determine what's right for your areas and what's not right for your areas, and could you outline who you, the impact that would have, but also, do you accept the premise of removing certain pre-application requirements to speed up planning processes? I'm not fussy about the order.
Sorry, you're referring to the new amendments?
New clause 44.
Yeah, not clause 44, but the original. Yeah, naturally, exactly. No, I mean, I think obviously coming through very, very, very quickly, and obviously that's I think the point is making, from a local authority perspective, making sure that if not a formal consultee, there is some other mechanism for local authorities and other to be able to feed into the process in a structured way to make sure their voices are heard, even if they're being reformed as a formal statutory consultee in that way.
Well, removing statutory consultees, sorry, as well,
Significant concern about that removal. That process is how you identify some of the specific issues on the ground that are going to need significant further investigation. I don't think you'll save any time by removing it, because the investigation will then turn out at the planning stage and you'll just delay planning, because these will be areas around statutory consultees. What it will do is give the public the impression that this is just being rubber stamped and railroaded through. That will be catastrophic. The NSIPs are such contested spaces already. We have got to give people the chance to raise those concerns, to identify those issues on the local level, on the ground, that need further work, need further attention. If we don't do that, people will lose all faith in that process, and they're already sceptical enough.
Thank you.
The same concerns. I mean, NSIP's obviously decided by the Secretary of State. I've got 5 in my district at the moment, including battery farms, solar farms and reservoir. It's not about objection, but consultation can actually bring forth some really good ideas. It can bring forward some solutions, some changes. It's massively important, for instance, even looking at if you're going to have that impact on your community, the community benefit that could be discussed right at the start, all sorts of improvements that could be put in place through consultation before it actually gets to the formal stage. So it's also the appearance of removing that consultation. In a time when LGR and devolution is meant to be bringing decentralisation, to actually just say this is all going to be decided centrally, not a good picture.
That's very clear. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Minister. Thank you, Chair. Could I ask you gentlemen about the reforms in the bill relating to planning decisions, and specifically our intention to take powers and to introduce a national scheme of delegation. How do you think that could be best designed? What are the types of applications you think should always be taken by planning committees? Which types of applications could be appropriately delegated to expert planning officers?
Well, for a start, the vast majority of planning permissions or plan applications are already decided by officers anyway, many councils. For instance, not something like 97% of my authority are already decided. So what exactly do you think we're now going to pass on, and even put more pressure? If it becomes the more...
Well, we heard earlier, for example, from the RTPI about the variation in the quality and effectiveness of schemes of delegation at a local level.
With regards to a national scheme, if it was advisory, not mandatory, if there was some general advice out there that could be given as a guidance, that would be better than mandating, because what could be mandated for one area, and where you look at super urban areas compared to rural areas, might not be exactly the same sort of decision making you're looking for.
The bill will mandate it. I'm asking you, what do you think is the most effective design for that national scheme of delegation we intend to introduce? Well, that's perfectly fine if you don't want it, but I'm just trying to get at, given we are intending to introduce it.
A common core that does give some, if there is a step. I'm not quite sure how the sort of mayoral tiers and other will feed into sort of responding to particular sort of issues around the urban and rural geographies, and obviously. So I think it's basic common core to this, and I think looking at how it might operate in practice. Again, I'm coming from an authority that has, only 3% go to committees. It all told is about 1.4% if you include all the advertising and listed building consents to go through. So very small amounts go through. And so there is a lot of that good practice that's happening already. But I think obviously, in terms of how that works, one of the things we want to make sure we don't lose is the ability, for example, if a scheme is likely to be rejected by officers, the ability to actually put that to a committee where that might actually come up to a more pragmatic decision than just a rigid response to policy. And I think also we want, there are some other things. We want to make sure that there are opportunities for councils to go to beyond a scheme of delegations. If there is like a national set thing, that you want to make sure that's not just a cap on what's delegated. Or not. So I think there is some flex around urban and rural, and very much working with local authorities about the design of the specific scheme, because I think it's very clear, want as much guidance as possible about the types of things that the government is wanting to see happen. And I think obviously from our perspective we understand the point about the centrality of getting the local plans and making the local plans as robust as possible to give people clarity about what goes on in future. Obviously the challenge comes when quite a lot of schemes come forward that aren't in full compliance with policy, because the real world is messy and things have to be traded off against each other. It's basically to what extent those trade-offs can be dealt with at office level versus at committee, and that's where we want to get into the detail with you on the details of that to make it work effectively.
I should say we're formally consulting about this matter alongside the bill, but I think it's just useful to draw out in design terms.
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of points to add. I think there are elements in what you're proposing that I would welcome. I mean, mandatory training, goodness knows why we don't have that already. Desperately needed. I'm not sure Richard would entirely agree, but when it comes to local plan allocated sites, the idea that could come to committee to then be refused, I struggle with. I think there is a benefit in committees looking at elements, or someone looking at elements of design and whether 106s are being carried out appropriately. But once something's gone through a local plan, I think we've got to be careful about where committees step in. But to give an example of where I think you've got to be incredibly careful with this, I took a planning application to committee last week. It was for a listed building where someone wanted to cut and raise a beam by 10 inches. They'd had a stroke. They were in a position where they were literally having to live in a conservatory. Officers had said no. I got that to a committee. The beam could be raised. That when they leave, the beam could be lowered. There was a stair lift to go in. And the committee almost unanimously approved it. Had we not had that ability to, on that incredibly basic level, to give someone the dignity of being able to get to their bathroom through a planning system where the harm was conceived by everyone as minimal, I mean, we can't lose that ability to resolve those local issues and those micro issues in a really local way. Finding the balance there is going to be challenging. Too much permitted development, too many automatics will prevent us from being able to do that. And I'm sure we could all give further examples where we've needed to use that ability to deal with things, very often with refusals, to enable them to be granted. On the flip side, sometimes it's fair to say members will get something that's recommended for approval and call it to committee because they don't like it. I do think we have to be able to justify on good planning grounds why on earth we're calling something to committee. And if we don't have them, I have no problem with officers turning around and saying, I'm sorry, you haven't got planning grounds. But it's finding that right balance.
Thank you.
Can I just come back, please? With regards to local plans and what Richard just referred to there, we already instigated that at our authority. You have to give planning reasons for bringing something to the planning committee. But to consider that you could just delegate a decision on a local plan allocated piece of land, some of those could be of a considerable size. They could be for a sustainable urban extension, for instance. And to just take the principle that because it's in the plan, it doesn't need to be at committee, then we are makers of place and we build homes, not houses. So we don't want to just see that officers are suddenly having to make a delegated decision on how many houses go on that piece of land based on how the developer wants to bring it forward. Then the master planning, the design coding, all of those issues need to be taken into consideration, which shouldn't be left to officers who will end up getting the same grief that members get, but as unelected officers.
And if I've understood you, I don't think we're suggesting that we want the most important, the most significant major applications to still come to committee. I suppose the examples we've given before are, should every reserve matters application come before a committee?
No.
But
it's not.
Should every small site application come before a committee?
No, they don't. Well, certainly don't to my authority. I mean, we had a thing where someone was saying we'd only built X number of houses in a public report, but the reality was that far more homes had actually gone through under delegated authority than had actually gone to committee. So we were being wronged by the fact we'd actually done that process more frequently.
But there may be some specific circumstance that creates a nuanced judgment where it absolutely should go to committee. And please don't just talk about the big projects. It's those small ones that are deeply personal to people, where national policy says no, but circumstance actually says you can get around national policy. Because
I take the point about the nuance. I think that's a helpful point. Thank you, Chair. Yeah.
Good evening. Thank you, Mr. Twigg, and thank you very much for and as a former councillor and living at home with a wife who is a current councillor, I know very much the struggles and challenges. You've made a powerful case about the importance of councillors in public acceptance of the decisions you're talking about, and I think, and you've highlighted actually approvals where the recommendation has been refusal. Liberal Democrats, we oppose this clause completely, but if the government insists on it, can I ask, would you want to see on the face of the bill some qualification of the power of central government to write your delegation agreements to council to your officers, because at the moment it's completely unqualified, the regulations that could be laid.
I mean, I think, as the Minister pointed out, the consultation is going on in parallel to the bill, and I think hopefully we can make this national scheme of delegation works, provided there is a degree of flexibility built into it. And I hope that sort of working between local government and national government can help resolve some of those issues at pace. So I think obviously there may be some need for some things specified in there, but we are hopeful that kind of engagement can help resolve some of these issues.
I think I would say that if what we see in a scheme of delegation are guidelines around how a scheme of delegation should work, I'm not sure that concerns me hugely. I think if they're prescriptive, we will fall into the problem that you will then create cases where you need to get round them and you can't because they're prescriptive and not guidelines. I mean, a simplistic example, I'll get into trouble now with the New Forest National Park Authority, but there we allow parish councils to call things into committee. I think that's crazy. It ends up with all sorts of things coming to committee that should never go near them. I would love a delegation that said they can't do that on a personal level. There are elements where I think government guidance would be really helpful.
Guidance.
But I think, pretty firm guidance, but still guidance with that ability where you really have that nuance to be able to work around it. Yeah.
Let's go back to the point about having a common core of things. There's certain things that apply in certain areas, and then then a space for guidance on top of that. I sense that's
Could I just come? What do you want to answer? And then
I agree as well. I think it should be guidance and not mandatory.
Yeah.
And I also think that there's always a problem. It's always that we seem to see policy brought forward on the basis that there's a problem. So perhaps for once we could go out to where it's actually planning is actually done well, where authorities have gone through this, where we've gone through modernising, where we do things the way that you would expect it to be done, and work with those authorities instead of just assuming that there's a problem in the planning system. And also, how far will this delegation go? Because if it turns into nothing more than delegating that's almost similar to permitted development rights, if people think that's not dangerous, then have a look at a picture of Terminus House in Harlow and see somewhere where you wouldn't want to live. And members were nowhere near that.
No further questions.
John Grady.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Twigg. It's great to have three very experienced councillors before the committee. We've heard evidence today, including from two former special advisors to Number 10 under the last government, that, and others, that this bill will help with energy security, energy costs, driving forward housing, getting jobs and significant investment. And I think a bit like channeling your discussion about the beam in the person's house, Councillor Clewer, we're evinced there was a significant amount of frustration of where we are with things in planning more generally. Could you identify what you see as positive in the bill, each of you?
I start. I mean,
Yeah,
I would agree there are areas around infrastructure provision where planning at the moment simply delays or blocks infrastructure provision, and that needs changing. I absolutely agree with that. To what extent it needs changing, I suspect people will judge differently based on where they live and the specific infrastructure that they're facing, but I think that needs unblocking. I do think you need to be very careful with the assumption that this bill will build more houses. This bill will not build more houses. This bill and the reforms we've seen to the MPPF will see more planning permissions. I have, 18,837 extant planning permissions in Wiltshire at the moment. Developers tell me they can only build just about 6,000, or the last time I asked them, which strangely enough was just under the 4-year housing land supply under the last government. I'm sure if I asked them today, they could build just about 8,000. I have 2,400 houses south of Trowbridge that have been stuck, failing to get the 106 signed for, 14 years or something now? There has got to be something in here that forces building. If we're going to issue planning, it's got to come with the actual development of that. We've got to start charging council tax on properties when the developers, the commitment they signed that they will complete houses on whatever basis and they fall behind, they need to start paying the council tax on them or something. And this bill at the moment, it's not going to do that, I'm afraid. I don't see anything in it that will actually achieve that.
I support Richard's point about working for more use it or lose it powers to actually make sure that planning permissions, it doesn't just go on the books to raise, obviously noting the points about the hope value and everything else, but raising land value and not doing much else. We recognise there are a whole heap of block challenges to delivery that sit outside the scope of the bill. I think in terms of the bill, obviously support the government's general principles about clarification, simplification, recognise that the strong national growth and infrastructure demands opening up some of the opportunities for green energy and all sorts of other things that we are calling for in local government. I want to draw attention, obviously, the work that's been done on looking at planning fees again. Obviously, making sure that local authorities can be better remunerated for the work to make sure they're covering their costs fully is absolutely key to making sure the system works well to deliver the outcomes that you're looking for. The key thing is you don't want but we recognise that alone isn't going to deal with this. We've got to look at how we can further strengthen the planning workforce, which is again making sure that the language isn't saying the planning system is the problem or the planners or you want people to go into the industry and you want to do it, but the planning fee stuff is helpful in terms of supporting that. But yeah, we sort of support the principles. I think the key thing is make sure local authorities retain a voice in what goes forward, and working with the government on some of the practical things around things like scheme of delegations.
Thank you. Yeah, Ms. Parson, I thought we've got close to it. So, as we said, we have nothing against professional training of planning committees, so that the industry knows what it's dealing with, and therefore it can't ever be used as to beat us over the head all the time that we don't know what we're doing on planning committees. But similar to Richard, between 2016 and 24 in my district, 11,500 permissions put in place, 5,500 built out, no excuse for the rest not to be built. And unfortunately, the proposals that have been put forward do not include anything at all to mandate that builders will build. There's a proposal over CPO, and the one that's really missing that we would like to see is they build it or lose it. If there's a site and it's allocated and they've got permissions and they simply don't build it, give us the CPO powers to actually CPO that. That would actually help to build houses, because we could then start to control the destiny of those sites. But at the moment, there's some really useful things that could have been in the bill that are missing.
But CPO it at agricultural value.
Agricultural, yeah, not hope value. Yeah.
Sorry, we just add, very much support the planning training, and also, but in slight contrast to the last thing, I think obviously the intention of the CPO power, from my perspective, is and the LGA supports the approach to hope value that the government's taking, and I think it's particularly it being deployed in urban settings around land assembly, which I think is obviously the intent behind the bill.
Agreed.
Two connected questions. There's been a lot said about the role of local authorities in decision making on planning. just like to ask you, I'm aware councils are not short of guidance from central government about planning. I think every element of the local plan has to be in detailed conformity with 19 chapters of a national planning policy framework, etc. already. So the first question is there any element of your local planning process that is there for any other purpose than complying with the law as passed by Parliament in respect to planning? So have you gold-plated locally the planning process is the first question. And then just coming back to the point about strategic infrastructure projects. And I know one of the issues with that is local authorities have a lot of obligations, in particular under environmental law, whereby they have a duty, a specific legal duty, around issues like air quality, where effectively excluding them from the decision-making process, or even their failing to intervene in the decision-making process, will leave them open to legal challenge. I know my own experience of Heathrow Airport and air quality was a good example, where it was a local authority fine of £300 million per annum for the level of breaches of air quality caused by Heathrow Airport, through which we would have been judicially reviewed by Client Earth, had we not judicially reviewed central government over their proposals to expand that. So can you think of some other areas around either environmental or other legal obligations that are imposed on local authorities where the role that you play in either the development and consent order process or those national strategic infrastructure projects is not arising simply out of local politics, it is there because of legal obligations to your residents that you have to fulfil?
With regards to NSIPs, for instance, I was thinking about the fact that we're responsible for environmental impact assessments. And I do worry at times that we don't have enough weight with those, that in the part of the actual decision making. And to give an example of that is one where we're just testing that at the moment with regards to battery storage, which is the new thing that's exciting lots of people. And whether we can actually not predict just the here and now, but what would happen in the event of a problem. So trying to decide that, for instance, if we are going to have a huge array of batteries on what was good agricultural land, suddenly blighting the landscape, is that can we make sure, for instance, that the industry is not allowed to use a type of battery that is more prone to cause huge environmental issues if for instance, it catches fire. Whereas regards to there are already good batteries in existence already that could be used, but it comes down to a financial decision. So in some places we would actually like stronger powers or more weight to be given to the powers that we've already got. But quite often, as you say, we find ourselves guarding the place and not being able to make the decision that needs the guards in the first place.
My concern is not about gold plating. I think it's the question of, do local authorities have the capacity in their planning teams, particularly across the country, to deal with the range and breadth of requirements that are placed on them? Obviously, that's one reason why local government reform is in the air. But I would as I said, welcome the movement on fees. And I think we've got to try and make sure that planning is seen as a field that people want to go into to help unlock these things, rather than them being seen just purely as the blockers. But ultimately, part of the blockers are if the system isn't working effectively. So it's how can we work with local authorities to deliver that, not only the training for committees, but also greater support to the officer corps to be able to move stuff through as quickly as possible.
I don't think we gold plate our local plans. I do think there are many councils that want to go beyond existing guidance, particularly on, for example, net zero, and that's mostly to stop expensive retrofit in the future and make people's bills cheaper. So there are areas where councils will want to go beyond existing policy, national policy, but everyone I can think of has been done for very good reason, and will end up with broad public support. On that bigger issue of legislation, there are some real challenges there. Some of the environmental legislations can be significantly challenging when you are looking at wanting to see building, or when you're looking at wanting to find a way to mitigate or even unlock. So an example, I've got a brownfield site in Trowbridge where the need to leave a bat corridor by a train line, how on earth that makes sense, I honestly don't know. But it's making the viability of the site really challenging. And that's something where some sort of off-site provision would be far more appropriate, far better for the bats, and would have helped unlock development. There are also problems you get around highways issues, for example, whether it be economic development or building land. The inability for us to work properly with national highways to deal with motorway junctions, or the A36 in my case, and the constraints that places, they can be real blockers to our desire to build in areas that would be sensible as opposed to the areas where developers are putting forward planning permissions. Lastly, it would be really nice if we could tell developers where they should be building rather than developers say, this bit of land, we can't build it yet, knowing full well that you'll get a speculative application the moment the local plan's through for that bit of land as well, having just fought the contentious bit of land.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you. So I'm coming at this from a different angle. We had a number of questions and answers from the previous panel on compulsory purchase order, particularly from the NFU, and I'm not dismissing their comments in any way, but not all areas of compulsory purchase orders are about farmland and areas like that. My city of Portsmouth, we have got buildings and derelict land that have had no planning on for decades. So how could the government support local authorities to deliver schemes in the public interest using these powers?
I think the LGA broadly supports the new powers. Obviously, we're looking to find ways to help ensure that local authorities are able to take advantage of these new powers when they're coming in, where that's, and again, that go back to sort of helping councils be more entrepreneurial about unlocking land and giving them the support they need to do that. So as I said, whether it's in Portsmouth, a place I know well, I was born there, or to a certain extent in parts of my patch, these are an important tool in the arsenal. But it's also about unlocking those conversations. It's about having that on the books should hopefully enable those conversations to happen, because that's what ultimately you want to come to an agreement with a partner to avoid having to go down and use legal powers. That's but I think it will help unlock those conversations. But as I said, it's still not making it. It's still not going to be a magic wand that we can say. And I'm not able to sort of walk down my high street and say, that, and suddenly unlock all these things. There's processes in place to prevent this being misused. So I think, but we do strongly welcome the intention to go into this space and the proposals that are in front of us.
I think if you look at the point about London and Land Assembly, they make a great deal of sense to me. Please be careful on the assumption that brownfield land, however, will be made viable simply through compulsory purchase. The problem with most brownfield development is a viability one. By the time you've demolished what's on it and then remediated the land, the net value of that land is negative. So there's no point in a council compulsory purchasing something that then has negative value for the council. We'll just bankrupt councils. If we're going to unlock brownfield, something more significant has got to be done to either use some sort of brownfield development fund. That feels a bit wrong, but it's a way you could look at it, or to make it to compel developers to deal with brownfield before they're allowed to build on greenfield. That we'd suddenly see the middle of towns all over the country being redeveloped at that point if they weren't allowed to build on the greenfield until they built on the brownfield.
Not to repeat any of the points, so brownfield, for instance, in a rural area could be something that had glass houses on it. So it could be a site that's got no connectivity whatsoever to any settlement, it's got no services, but it's brownfield land, so it would come under potentially CPO. But the DCN as well, we think that there should be a subsection to CPO, and that's with regards to not just concentrating on land, but if we want to look at regeneration, if we want to look at the issues maybe in town centres where there's vacant properties, there's areas that are blighted maybe by crime, or just they just need that added value, then at the moment the CPO process is still a little bit too legal heavy. And the route to appeal, which generally a lot of it will go through, it will take far too long. So perhaps there's a role going forward with mayoral authorities for that to be the appeal route. So if we could see a system that shortens the CPO process for regen of property in town centres, different to land assembly, then that would be useful.
To the end of the allocated time to ask questions, just to see a few seconds left, so I'm going to move on now. Can I thank the panel for answering the questions and thank them for the time. Can we change over to the new panel, please? Members, honourable members, and vice honourable members, whether can permission to remove their jackets. You're welcome to remove your jackets.
Big question.
The brains work.
from Catherine Howard, partner Head of Planning at Herbert Smith Freehills. For this session, we have until 4:40. Shadow Minister.
Thank you. Pleated workforce, Mr. Twig. It's just me now. Thank you very much for coming and welcome. May I call you Catherine? Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Catherine. The Minister and I have regularly been on statutory instrument committees. We've been on committees in the House where we agree, and this side of the Conservative Party agree with the government's proposals over planning fees. And we've been on many committees together where we haven't contested those. I was just wondering whether you could just elaborate to the committee how helpful you think the government's proposals have been in terms of ring-fencing planning fees and how prescriptive you find that is and whether it could be improved. And could you outline how you think that the measure that's being proposed could help the speediness of planning applications, but also have a greater impact on some of the workforce challenges that local government has had in terms of recruiting, keeping and holding on to planning experts, but also whether you think that the current legislation proposals will allow local authorities to have enough funding or enough money to keep town planners in local authority town halls and not going off to private companies.
So the way it's drafted to me looks like it is highly prescriptive and going to be very effective at ring fencing. It seems to me, just looking at the wording of it, it talks about the need to secure that the income from the fees or charges is applied towards the carrying out the functions that are listed. And then you look at what those functions are, and they are dealing with planning applications, certificates of lawfulness, tree applications, listed buildings, etc. There are things it doesn't deal with, which is presumably deliberate. So general enforcement and plan making. It seems to me the way it's drafted, you couldn't use the money from all of those developer application fees to just apply it to plan making and those kind of functions. So if that's the intention, I think that's to me it appears to achieve. And with regard to recruitment, I mean, it's interesting. I know that fee recovery has been something that has been put into law in a number of different regimes, planning regimes, and I'm more of a specialist in the nationally significant infrastructure regime, where those provisions have been added quite liberally. It'll be interesting to see how effective that is, a kind of pay-as-you-go system. My concern still, in terms of how effective that will be at recruitment and retention, is that I don't know how much flexibility statutory authorities have got to actually set pay scales, public pay scales. So I would have thought, again, not an expert in this area, that if you want to attract and keep people who are otherwise tempted to go off to the private sector, where pay seems to be higher, particularly with supply and demand at the minute, the way it is, you would need to make the actual pay scales that are applicable higher, rather than just, I'm not sure that the fees that are attracted by a developer can just be used to give people bonuses or higher salaries within the private sector. So that would be my concern there. With regard to speed, whether, I mean, yes, if somehow the fees can be used to recruit and retain more people within planning authorities, then that's got to be a good thing, as it does seem to me that there has been more and more of a drain of talent out of the local authorities and all of the public sector authorities, regulators, post-COVID in particular, now that people can work from home, some of the benefits of working with slightly more flexibility that the public sector was always better at than the private sector, that's slightly gone as well. So I imagine there's more of an inducement for people to move across if they're being offered more money. So I recognise the problem for sure.
Thank you very much.
Minister. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Catherine, for giving up your time this afternoon. Two questions, if I can, on the NSIP regime, on development consent orders, which are your specialism, I understand. Sure. The first is, you will have seen that the government tabled a series of amendments yesterday to remove the statutory requirement to consult on as part of the pre-application stage. But if you could give us your sense on the impact you'll think that have in terms of the speed of the consenting process overall, and what you broadly expect applicants to do now those requirements have been removed, but that new statutory guidance will be introduced setting out what we expect. So is it a mature enough system now that we can expect most applicants to be still consulting, engaging meaningfully? And what are the incentives at play there to ensure that they will? And then secondly, broadly in terms of the ambition to provide for a more certain and faster consenting NSIP process, do you think there's anything we're missing here that we should still look at?
Thank you. Yeah. No, I mean, I hugely welcome that change yesterday. I think in terms of speeding up and cutting out bureaucracy that was unnecessary and helped no one except professionals like me to spend more time and of our, gain more fees out of our clients. It's hugely welcome. There is, as we just talked about, there's a lack of enough professionals in the whole industry to staff the system. The government's ambition is to triple the rate of DCO consenting to get 150 DCOs through in this Parliament. And we can't magic up more comms consultants, lawyers, EIA consultants, planning consultants in that period. So what we need desperately is a way to apply those professionals most efficiently in a really focused way across all of the projects that we need. And I've seen it in my career. I've seen it having consented a number of projects across, since 2008 when the regime came in. Without the law changing at all, custom and practice has built up gold plating and precedent to actually slow the system down hugely, and particularly the pre-app process, which I think under the government stats it says has gone from an average of 14 months to 27 months. From 2008 till a few years ago. I suspect it's even longer now. And so what I've seen is more and more rounds of consultation when there have been small changes, developers not putting through other changes that actually would be really beneficial and actually often wanted by communities or statutory consultees, because they'd have to have a 3, 4, 6 month delay to actually do more consultation on that change. So it's made I think the cart's before the horse. It's sort of become a very clunky and bureaucratic, legalistic process rather than what planning should be and is in all other regimes, town and country planning and even hybrid bills, where you've got more latitude to change your mind, do some lighter touch consultation if it's appropriate, do some focused consultation with the key statutory consultees on the key issues, rather than produce these huge preliminary environmental information reports, which are incredibly daunting and time-consuming for everyone to read, both at the public sector, local authorities, the regulators, the public, feeling overwhelmed by the amount of information which is put out there, which is ultimately just a form of kind of legal box ticking without the kind of laser focus that you really need on key issues. So I hugely welcome it. And I've got to say I was with an investor, an international investor, yesterday, interested in investing in the UK in a big portfolio of solar projects that have not yet been consented. And just I was asked to explain the regime, and the pre-app is always something I felt I have to apologise for and explain and sort of give them the best news story about how quick it might be. But it was great yesterday. They really welcomed this change, and I think can see it being highly beneficial for investors who can shop around Europe and elsewhere in terms of bringing development here.
Anything we're missing?
On pre-app, just generally
just
on
broadly
the NSIP
speeding
regime.
up and making more certain the NSIP process.
I think there's perhaps some guidance to the planning inspector about how to run the examinations with a slightly more focus than has seen. I think there's been a drift towards more questions, more rabbit holes. Again, we don't have time for this. We don't have enough professionals in the industry to, and it doesn't seem to benefit, to my point of view, the consenting system. The fact that too has slowed down and become a bit more less focused and more bureaucratic. So anything we can do to encourage the examination process to be more focused, possibly shorter as well, but certainly less labour intensive unless there's a purpose for it, I would welcome that.
Thank you.
Okay. Good evening.
Thank you, Mr. We're sympathetic in Liberal Democrats to a number of the changes the government's proposing to compulsory purchase and to nationally significant infrastructure project regime. You mentioned the length of examinations, and you're absolutely right. Inspectors have taken longer and longer. I did one in 4 months, which is 2/3 of the statutory time at 6 months. But what they're trying to do, aren't they, is avoid judicial review by asking as many questions and making sure all the issues are addressed. And we're in a more litigious society, aren't we? How do we get out of the loop of trying to de-risk to prevent judicial review, but at the same time have a speedier examination?
I think there should be some education on judicial review for inspectors, because actually as a lawyer I can tell you the bar and the things that people bring judicial review on, it's not because there weren't enough questions asked or the environmental statement wasn't long enough. You will never pick the one thing that someone brings a judicial review on. Most of them aren't successful, and they're very, very niche. I think inspectors, if they were, that probably is one of their fears. And also I think they want to be seen to hear all of the issues, even if actually they know that they're not going to be material to the determination. That wasn't really the purpose of the regime. It was supposed to be mostly written reps, etc. But I think, I think we could do some education for the inspectorate about the things that do and don't actually lead to judicial reviews, and actually they've got a lot of latitude in terms of what it's rational for them to consider a material planning consideration and what isn't, and so the depth to which they need to look into things. I think they sometimes go slightly overboard.
If I can ask one more question, just on turning to the compulsory purchase changes and the clauses about hope value, which would enable the acquisition of land at lower at existing use value. As someone practicing in the private sector, how do you think, I'm supportive of that as a clause, but as someone in the private sector representing landowners, how do you think that will take effect, and will it be plain sailing?
I mean, it's not my particular area of specialism, that side of the planning regime, but I mean, obviously I can imagine that if you're not, hope value is part of the value of the land as far as, the ordinary person sees it. I suppose they're not going to be delighted if they're not going to get paid what they will see as part of the value of the land. So it's a wider public interest test, isn't it? So I'm not saying it's the wrong thing to do, but I imagine that they will object to compulsory purchase orders perhaps a bit more than they otherwise would, if they know that they're actually not going to get the market value. And of course, if the compulsory purchase order is made, then they might actually try and bring more judicial reviews. Although the test, I think it would be quite hard for them to bring a judicial review on the basis of the test, which is quite wide in terms of the purposes for which hope value can be disapplied. As long as you're within those tests as the government, then or the local authority acquiring, I think it would be hard to JR on that basis, but they might find other grounds, procedural grounds, to have a go.
Thank you.
You've got just over a minute, so John Grady, but just a very quick answer as well.
Quick final question. We need huge investment in infrastructure of the United Kingdom. The capital for this is international, and we need to attract international investors to fund this investment. Does this bill make us more attractive or less attractive to international investors in your professional view?
It definitely makes us more attractive to international investors, like I say, on the nationally significant infrastructure side. I also like the fact that we can now opt out of the DCA regime, the nationally significant regime, because sometimes it's lighter touch and more helpful to go local. So that's very helpful as well. Like I say, the pre-app stuff's incredibly helpful, and the national policy stuff. So I agree, I think that's helpful. And also the EDP stuff, the nature recovery matters in relation to housing, although just to flag, I will be making a submission about how I think the bill could go a bit further in terms of habitats, regulations, matters with regard to nationally significant infrastructure, because I think the nature recovery plans are slightly harder to apply. Sorry.
4 questions for this session. Can I, on behalf of the committee, thank you for your evidence. Can we now change the panel over, please? alongside Link, Mike Seddon, Chief Executive at Forestry England, Carol Hawkey, Director of Estates at Forestry England, and for this panel we have until 5:05. Shadow Minister Paul Holmes.
Thank you, Mr. Twigg. Welcome to the committee, and thank you very much for your time this afternoon. I only have one question on this section, Mr. Twigg, because we've and it's no detriment to you guys. We've recycled some of the themes, and I know that there are backbench members who want to ask questions too. So I'll be very quick. In terms of the bill's provisions, we've had a lot of conversations and a lot of evidence today regarding the Nature Restoration Fund element to the legislation, and some concerns from, for example, in my constituency, the Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust and other organisations, that the provisions of the bill through the Nature Restoration Fund and other elements such as EDPs and Natural England's ability to manage those. Can I ask you whether you are confident that under the current provisions of the bill as laid down, that nowhere in the country who's being affected by the NRF or by an EDP will see a reduction of environmental standards, and in fact this bill will do what it attempts to outline, which is an increase in environmental standards across the United Kingdom? Can I start with you, please, Mr. Benwell?
Thank you so much for having me. Just very quickly to deal first of all with the question of whether nature is a blocker, because that's come up a lot today. It's an absurd notion to suggest that it's the fault of nature or environmental regulations that we're not getting the infrastructure development that the government wants, or indeed the renewables infrastructure development that we want. And it's worth noting that Natural England reckons 99% of the housing applications it's consulted on go through perfectly properly, and only 1% receive objections on the basis of environmental concerns. And for major infrastructure, it's worth noting that you heard earlier that the vast majority of major infrastructure projects are JR'd because of environmental concerns. That is just both misrepresentation and factually inaccurate. There's been a recent spike, yes, but the long-term trend is that just 10% of major infrastructure projects are challenged, and lots of those go through the paper permission stage and have been found to have merits. So it's really important not to get drawn into this sense that nature and development are at odds. They can proceed perfectly well together. So the question is how to do that. And we think the government is genuinely on to something, that there are ways both to speed up development and allow developers to meet their environmental obligations more quickly and more simply at the same time as helping to restore nature. And we know that the planning system needs to do more to restore nature, so that aspiration for a win-win is a really good one. But to return to your question, we think at the moment as the bill is drafted, that's not what's on the page of the law. And that what's here at the moment would represent a regression in terms of the strength of environmental law. We're in a situation at the moment where there's a high degree of certainty about the environmental results that are supposed to result for environmental law, and that's being swapped for, frankly, a lot of wishful thinking in the way that the bill is framed. It would allow developers to pay a levy, to discharge their environmental responsibilities, and then through legislative sleight of hand and some magical legal jiggery-pokery, that would be replaced where a situation where there's a lot of subjective opinion in the way that results are judged. The mitigation hierarchy would be lost, so the expectation to avoid harm would be short-circuited. We'd be in a situation where damage could happen now in return for promises of environmental improvements in the future that are very, very loosely measured in terms of the bill. We have a situation where at the moment developers are expected fully to pay for environmental results, but we see the bill setting out a situation where developers may only pay part of the costs of remediation, and that's subject to a viability test. And then the government's putting a lot of reliance in its bill on this idea of an overall improvement test, where the Secretary of State is allowed to bring in an environmental delivery plan if it is likely to lead to measures that will outweigh the harm to nature. And that likely to test is a much lower legal bar of certainty from the one that we have at the moment, where you need a high degree of scientific certainty that the environmental measures will actually lead to results. But it's really worth emphasising, I understand why a lot of people want to immediately pause Part 3 of the bill, because we are in an ecological crisis. 19% of species abundance lost since 1970 in the UK. That's 32% in England. And 1 in 6 species at risk of extinction. So to mess with the laws that are our most important nature laws is a really risky thing to do. But what I would much rather see is the law being amended through committee and through this process, so that the win-win that the government has rightly identified, that actually we can spend some of that developer money better to lead to bigger, better projects for nature restoration at the same time as speeding up development, can be achieved. And we've got some proposals for how the bill could be amended in some quite simple but important ways to bring back in that mitigation hierarchy, to get you surety of results, and to make sure that polluters really do pay for harm. So love to talk through those with the committee as we go.
Thank you very much. I'm sure the Minister is studying them very carefully, as am I. Would the other 2 witnesses like to come forward on that aspect of the question? If you don't need to. Okay, fine. One very quick question, and I'm afraid, again, it's to you, Mr. Benwell, and I apologise to the other witnesses. It's no detriment to your character or your expertise at all. And I hope you don't think I'm being cheeky by asking this, but part of a lot of the witness evidence and questioning today from myself, my colleagues, and also the Liberal Democrat colleagues on the committee, is the resourcing and the ability of Natural England to undertake the responsibilities to which the Secretary of State is proposing. In your previous guise of working within the Department for the Environment and working with a Secretary of State, and now having the expertise in your current role, do you think that under its current guise, Natural England is capable of undertaking those responsibilities which are being outlined within the legislation? And are you worried about the resourcing of that organisation going forward, considering that they will have quite new, detailed and complicated responsibilities going forward?
There's no doubt that Natural England will need a significant uplift in resourcing to enable it to do this job properly. So Natural England was subject to some pretty serious cuts over the last decade, and the last settlement wasn't very positive for Natural England either, with more job losses coming. And even when you look into the statistics of Natural England's funding, some of the increases that we've seen in recent years have been on capital fund rather than the day-to-day spend on the kind of experts we need out on the ground to do this work. And part of the problem, actually, that we see sometimes with the risk-averse nature around the current incarnation of the habitats regulations is that lack of expertise from advisors to have the confidence to go out and to suggest where strategic solutions can happen, and to have the confidence to implement the law well. So Natural England will definitely need a boost, and it's just worth noting that it's not even able to fulfil all of its current duties to the standard that we would expect. Only half of SSSIs have been visited in something like the last decade, and already Natural England is having to focus in its work on statutory advice for planning applications. So it will need more of that expertise. But we do have confidence in the organisation, and we do have confidence in its leadership. So we hope that the government will come forward and properly resource Natural England and other agencies to help to make this work if it goes ahead as amended.
Thank you very much. No further questions.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all for coming to give evidence. A question for Richard, but I'm sure the other 2 witnesses will have views, assuming you share some of the concerns that have just been outlined. Richard, you will know we don't accept that development has to come at the expense of nature. We are very much targeting a win-win solution when it comes to development and the environment, and the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs and I have had a huge amount of engagement with you and others in the sector to try and develop a solution that achieves that. I wanted therefore to sort of drill into some of the concerns you've outlined, and in 2 ways specifically. First, on introduction, you stated, and I quote, you welcomed, and I quote, the legal guarantee that the Nature Restoration Fund must not only compensate for damage, but actually benefit protected wildlife. But the claim is today that the bill leaves us open to regression. Could you just elaborate on how those 2 square together? And then secondly, particularly given you've just said in relation to Natural England, you've got confidence in the organisation, confidence in the leadership. Marion Spain, the CEO, gave evidence earlier today, and she said, and I quote, that the bill effectively maintains the mitigation hierarchy. You've said the bill undermines the mitigation hierarchy. Can you clarify why you've got a difference of opinion with Marion on that particular issue, it seems?
Of course. So on the first question, we were grateful for engagement ahead of the bill, and we were really pleased to hear your aspirations to achieve the win-win. The question is whether the overall improvement test in Clause 55, subsection 4, does what it's meant to do. And when you look at the legal drafting, it suggests that a Secretary of State can only agree an environmental delivery plan if he's satisfied that it's likely to that benefits for a protected feature are likely to outweigh harm to that protected feature. And that comes some way short of the high bar of legal certainty that's expected in the current habitats regulations provisions. And then if you dig further into the bill, you find that once an environmental delivery plan is in place, if there's evidence that it's not meeting the standards expected, it's up to the Secretary of State whether to withdraw the EDP and then only to take measures that he considers appropriate to remediate for any shortfall in environmental benefits that are supposed to be derived from the measures in the bill. Both of those leave far more leeway for a Secretary of State to undercut nature restoration than compared to the current situation, especially when it can happen up to 10 years after the initial harm to nature. And we all have heard of some of those circumstances where promised offsets for supposed harm to nature never materialise or, die a couple of years down the line. But we think this can really be fixed, Minister. We think that if you were to strengthen that requirement so that it matches the kind of legal certainty that we see in the habitats regulations, you'd be in a much better position. And then on the positive side of the scale, if that promise to outweigh harm were a more substantive requirement to go beyond just about offsetting into real nature restoration, then you start to get to the territory where this really could be a win-win. But we know you'll be advised. We know you'll be advised by government lawyers to minimise risk. That's what always happens, and that's why governments really like to have these subjective tests. But as it stands, that level of certainty of environmental benefit that's required of an EDP up front and then that's required of proof of delivery along the way is less than under the current law.
That's a very clear elaboration. And on the Natural England point, on the mitigation hierarchy?
Yeah, so as it stands, before a development that would have adverse effects on a protected site can go ahead, it's necessary first to try to avoid those harms, then to reduce those harms, and only then, if it's once all those steps have been gone through, if a project is of overriding public interest, can it go ahead with compensation in place? The bill essentially short-circuits that process. In Clause 50, there's a provision that makes explicit that that the compensatory measures set out in an EDP don't need to apply to the particular features and the particular sites that's concerned by a development. And a developer can essentially, once they've paid their levy, disregard the provisions that are in the habitats regulations at the moment and go straight to development. Of course, that's something that we could, again, fix in the bill by requiring Natural England to have confidence that development applications have sought to avoid harm before they go ahead. And I really think that there would still be substantial and material benefits for developers in terms of the simplicity of the process, in terms of their legal confidence, even if that requirement to avoid harm were put back in. We know that there would need to be some flexibility in terms of, say, phasing of benefits versus time, but you could still have that really important principle that you shouldn't go straight to squishing the ancient woodland, that you shouldn't make it easy to splat the species. You need to make sure that you try and avoid that harm first before that development goes ahead.
So just so I'm really clear, because I think this is important given what we're asking Natural England to do, you, without causing any tension between you and Marion Spain, but you effectively disagree as she put it, as I quote, that the bill effectively maintains the mitigation hierarchy?
Yes, certainly at the project level.
Okay.
There's more of a requirement for Natural England to consider some of those circumstances at the EDP level, but when it comes to the specific projects, where of course it's all important for the particular site or species, we think it's short-circuited, but we'll check in with Marion on that afterwards.
Great, thank you very much.
Okay, we've got possibly going to get two in. If we're sort of succinct with our questions and answers, so we'll have Ellie Towin next. Ellie, John.
Thank you, Mr. Twig. Two of my questions have already been asked, so I will move, and again, this is to Richard Benwell. You talked, apologies to the other, you also talked, in addition to bringing back in the mitigation hierarchy, about the need to make sure that polluters really do pay. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. Let me see if I can wrinkle out my clause numbers. I think it's clause 62 that requires the EDP levies to be set at a level that takes into account the viability test, and we all know how often viability gives wriggle room for developers, and it's our view that that the level of payments for the levy should be enough to secure the compensatory measures needed to go further than remediating the damage caused to nature. And again, when you look further, you'll find that the provisions say that the levy needs to cover in whole or in part the amount that's needed to remediate that damage. And that could lead to dangerous situations where you're cross-subsidising developers for harm to nature from other pots of money, like farming funds, for example. It would make far more sense to have a straight-up polluter pays principle where developers pay for the cost of remediating the harm they cause to nature.
And indeed, that's one of the fundamental environmental principles of the government, isn't it? So for consistency, that would need to be the case if the bill was to do what it says on the tin at the front, which is not reduce environmental protection.
We have a polluters possibly pay principle here. We have a maybe prevent principle with the mitigation hierarchy. We have in terms of the overall improvement test, it's a possibly improved test. So all the way round, those fundamental principles are brought into doubt by the way the bill is drafted at the moment, particularly for species protection, where these are least appropriate.
But you're saying these are easily fixable through amendment. They're not devastating to the bill in principle.
They can be fixed, and it will take bravery and leadership from the government on this, we know, and we hope that ministers will go for it and the House will unite behind those changes.
Yeah, thank you.
Monsieur Callison.
I think my question's been answered, so if others want to come in, that's fine.
Thank you, Mr. Twig. Sorry,
oh.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Chair. I'm afraid my remarks or questions are going to go to Richard as well. So apologies to the other witnesses. I just wanted to take back to your original sort of comment around nature and development not needing to be in conflict, which I entirely agree with you on. But you also pointed out that we're sort of suffering from significant species loss and degradation in the environment. And I think the reason why I, as someone who's worked on both housing and protecting the environment for the last 10 years, support this approach is because the current system is not delivering. Well, do you agree that the current system is not delivering for either nature or development, and that a new approach, this strategic approach, notwithstanding the flaws, which I think there can be some honest disagreement on what the outcomes might be, but do you welcome the fact that there is a new approach being proposed, given that the current system isn't delivering for either development or nature?
Well, there's good scientific evidence that habitats regulations are the most effective site and species protections in the world, but we do still definitely need to go further. And some of those strategic solutions, particularly for landscape issues like water pollution, like air pollution, like water availability, can be improved. But you're right, there are loads of places where we could go further. We'd love to see things like building regulations for biodiversity in the bill to help get that nature built into the fabric of development as we go. But to suggest that the habitats regulations aren't working is wrong. But they can definitely be improved in implementation and more use made of this kind of strategic approach if it's done well.
Thank you, Mr. Twig. I feel it would be a shame for Carol Hawkey or Mike Seven to have visited this wonderful building without made a contribution to our understanding. So we've had a lot of discussion about what the Natural England Chief Executive said earlier. She was very clear in her testimony that she feels that the provisions in the bill do not have the effect of reducing current levels of environmental protection. What do you feel about that? And linked to that, do you feel that this bill strikes the right balance between agriculture, environmental protection, housing, and all of the other things that the planning system is here to deliver?
Thank you for the question. Thank you for inviting us. We've got to be, I'll give you a perspective from a land manager. Forestry England is the large land manager in England. We're responsible for the public forest. So I'm not an expert on the development bill, but from our perspective, the idea that environmental delivery plans can secure an improvement, it would be correct, and it's particularly appealing if they can do that at a strategic scale. So if anything that would start to join up nature across the country, which parts of the provision of the bill will enable us to do, would be a good thing.
Anything to add? Thank you, Chair.
A few minutes left. Anybody else want to? Yeah, leave it.
So I'm just trying to understand, if that's okay, Richard, if I come to you as well, sorry. Just so, you know, I've watched programmes, I've worked in the world of climate, spoke at COP26, so I've got a bit of background. So you know, you've talked to us about the number of species that are dying out now, yeah? I know that they're dying out globally at rates that are 100 times faster than normal evolutionary rates of extinction. You know, we're in a bad place, yeah? And there's a lot to be done. But that's with the existing stuff that precedes this. That's the position that we're in. So I can't understand why, you know, a change isn't going to be better in order to facilitate an improvement in nature, as well as planning, that leads to growth, that can then put money back into the system to improve it further.
Because the change that's proposed at the moment would weaken that level of protection and make unsustainable...
You're saying it will make it worse?
Yes, but it could make it better if you did it well. At the moment, it would make it worse because it allows developers to short-circuit mitigation hierarchy and go straight to damage. It's worse because the level of certainty of environmental benefits is lower than currently required by the law. It's worse because it allows damage up front in return for promises of remediation up to 10 years down the line. And it's worse in terms of the scientific evidence that would be needed to apply to new site source species. But the kind of approach that the government's talking about could work if some of those problems are fixed. And it's worth saying that if you really wanted a planning bill to turn around those problems you've described, this might help, but far more important it would be to make sure that you meet the global commitment to allocating 30% of the land and sea for nature, that you turn to thinking about how to manage our land and sea better for farmers and fishers and pay them properly for nature benefits, and thinking about the way we build nature into development. So there are far more things that could be in this bill if the objective were to save nature. And at the moment, the trade-off that we're being asked to take in terms of weakening what are tried and tested, strong, effective environmental laws in return for a sliver of hope that the benefits might outweigh the harm doesn't warrant the changes that are being made. But I keep returning to it, it could, if this bill and if Part 3 is improved during parliamentary passage, and that's what we'd really like to work with you to do.
Within seconds of the allotted time, so I'll call it order, and can I thank the panel, the witness, for the evidence on behalf of the committee. And can now we change over panel, and we go on to panel 10 now, is it? Yeah, panel 10. Housing Federation. For this session, just so members are clear for time, we have until 5:30. the witnesses are ready, can I ask the opposition spokesperson, Paul Holmes, if he wishes to start?
Thank you, Mr. Twigg. Just one very quick question from myself, which I imagine is probably more relevant to Mr. Stevens and not Mrs. Henderson. Hello, Kate. I don't mean anything bad by that. It's been a long-term feature of this bill, and ever since this government's been elected, that we and the government disagree on some of the elements along the government's housing target regime and the algorithms and focus of where those housing targets are most lying within the United Kingdom. So there shouldn't be any surprise that I want to ask about new towns. Can I ask you, Mr. Stevens, do you think the Minister and the Secretary of State have been less than forthcoming in whether they think that new towns should be included within housing targets across the UK, and no answers are coming forward for that? Do you think that new towns should be included and should contribute to local authorities' housing targets?
I think the government is still thinking through the best way to deal with that. So in the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, there are provisions relating to the definition of development management companies and such. And I think, I think, as I said, I think the government's still working it through. I think in terms of the work of the New Towns Commission and the identification of new towns, I think it's the HBF's view that they should probably not contribute to local authority targets, but kind of be treated as a contingency, as a pool, to ensure that the housing requirements under the mandatory standard method, which is a major step forward, can be achieved in the event that perhaps you get underbounded cities that are unable to meet their needs in full. And even if the provisions relating to spatial development strategies, even if those come forward, it is still possible that some of those might not be successful in meeting the entirety of the standard method. So I think it's probably realistic, it would probably be sensible, as the new Labour administration did with eco-towns, that they should contribute to filling a national shortfall rather than actually contributing to local authority targets. That would be my recommendation, but I don't think we have asked the government, and the government hasn't reached a view on that as yet, as far as I understand. So.
Thank you. It's very clear. Thank you very much. No further questions.
We'll happily leave it to other names.
Okay, can I give you a name or something, please?
Can I ask you both, and welcome to the committee, thank you for coming today. Can I ask you both what the role of targets for, we hear a lot about targets for housing numbers, and there's a lot of debate about that, and MPPF and so on. What should be the role of targets for delivery of social homes in the planning system?
So firstly, it's a pleasure to be before the committee. Thank you for inviting the National Housing Federation to give evidence. Just to be clear and to clear up front that I am a member of the government's New Towns Task Force working on the advice to government on a new generation of new towns. So I won't be commenting on no problem, but I won't be commenting specifically on what's coming forward from that piece of work. But from a National Housing Association perspective, just on the principle of new towns, I just think it is worth recognising just how acute the level of housing need is in this country. We have 160,000 children who are homeless right now. We have 310,000 children who had to share a bed with a family member last night. It is acute, and it's right across the country. And so the need for social housing is huge. I think the government has set out a very ambitious target of 1.5 million homes across the course of this parliament. We think about a third of those need to be affordable and social housing. And so research that we've commissioned shows that we need around 90,000 social rented homes each year, every year. And that's not just in this parliament, that's over the course of a decade to meet the backlog of need. Now, we're a long way off that target, but it is a really important part of it is to have planning reform, not just the mechanisms of planning and targets within the planning system, and the standard method is an important part of that, but also the resources within the social housing sector, local government and delivery partners to actually crank up the delivery. So this is an important part of the piece, but we're also very much looking forward to the spending review to get a long-term housing strategy in place that also has measures to inject stability, certainty, confidence back into the social housing sector to crank up delivery.
And if I may say something on that, I absolutely agree with Kate that it's very important that we do what we can to support affordable housing delivery. The government's proposals around spatial development strategies, which would allow those strategies to define policies on affordable housing, I think would be very beneficial. I think the work around looking at the Section 106 model, which is a current barrier at the moment, and I think probably the government needs to invest to ensure, as Kate said, something about the long-term rent settlement, providing more assurance for housing associations in that regard. That's a major obstacle to housing delivery at the moment, and just taking London as an example, it's resulting in a major shortfall in supply. But I think the spatial development strategies, I think, should be really quite useful mechanisms, so long as they're not too prescriptive. The problem we have with London, as an example, is that it had a very prescriptive affordable housing policy that didn't really last through the economic cycles that we're experiencing at the moment. You need something which is loose a bit, that constituent local authorities can then adapt to their own local circumstances.
And if I can ask supplementary of James, obviously we hear a lot from the Federation about the viability challenge of sites, without rehearsing, you know, the whole system and the pressures on development value. What is the HBF's approach in terms of how that should be that issue should be resolved, so that there are fewer schemes going back to appeal, having 106s renegotiated, having the affordable housing targets reduced, as we see in all our constituencies?
We think affordable housing as part of Section 106 is probably one of the most important planning obligations, and our members generally support that because they know how to build houses. Many of the other things that, so you know, capturing an element of development gain is a kind of real feeding frenzy, particularly by every public agency of the state. They're all attempting to finance their policy objectives off the back of capturing an element of the development land value. And that can result in very difficult competing claims over viability. I've looked at viability plans supporting lots of spatial strategies and local plans up and down the country. And it is the case that very often you have large elements of a local authority area which are unviable because they just can't afford the cumulative claims upon that development value. So I think greater scrutiny at the examination level, and perhaps a strong steer from the government that affordable housing and public contributions to public transport are the foremost claims upon development value, would be a very major step forward. But, you know, Savills has identified that the viability system, Section 106, community infrastructure levy, it's fairly successful. It's pretty successful at capturing the majority of development, you know, value that's out there. And the government could go further by being very clear that these are the requirements in local plans and they are not negotiable. Schemes are expected to be policy compliant, but that would need to be underpinned by a more rigorous system of assessing viability at the local plan stage. But then that would provide the government with the certainty.
Firstly, James, I'd like to ask you, we've heard a lot on earlier panels today about numbers of permissions that have been granted but not yet delivered. How do you think your members can be helped perhaps by this bill to deliver those homes? And also, when we talk about affordable housing, how much of that really needs to be socially rented housing to help with delivering homes that those homeless people need? And I think that's more to Kate as well.
On the first element of that question, you know, we really do dispute this notion that house builders just bank land and they're not interested in building out. And Craig Bennett of the Wildlife Countryside Link, I think at Radio 4, quoted a figure of 1.4 million homes that have granted permission but have not been built out. strongly contest that. A lot of those things, you know, aren't counted as a completion until they're actually completed. A lot of those schemes have to work through very complicated discharge conditions. A lot of those can just be outline planning permissions, not detailed planning permissions, which you need to be an implementable consent. And a lot of those are just poor figures which don't actually reflect, you know, the true numbers that have actually been built out. And lastly on that, you know, this accusation has often been levelled at the house building industry, land banking over the last 20 years. Consistently, independent studies, including the Competition and Market Authority last year, gave us a clean bill of health on that. There is an issue about absorption rates, you know, the ability of a local market to absorb certain sales, but house builders do not make their money out of sitting on land. That costs them money. We make money from the sale of homes. The issue about social housing, sorry, I want to allow Kate to come in here, but social housing is very, very important. The problem is it can be, you know, we have a severe housing crisis. As Kate said, we've got many thousands of children into temporary accommodation. Local authorities are having to spend something like 2.3 billion last year on temporary accommodation. You know, local authorities would go bankrupt there. The tendency, therefore, is to try and maximise social housing provision, social rented housing, which we can understand. We can understand why local authorities want to do that. But the problem is, which is following up the point that I made to Gideon Amos, that if local authority policies are too prescriptive on the split, the tenure split, then it can mean that it's very difficult for house builders to then contract with registered providers to provide registered providers with the type of tenure mix that they need. We kind of need to be a bit more realistic and a bit more flexible about that. The key issue is to get houses built, you know, is really to focus on the quantity in order to alleviate the problems of affordability that makes people so dependent upon social housing in the first place. But absolutely, social housing, social rented housing, is very important. We're not trying to say that we don't want to build it.
Thank you.
So in terms of social housing, it is needed in every part of the country, and I think what's really important is that we have objectively assessed need, and that is then incorporated in local plans, and we deliver mixed sustainable communities that reflect the need of those local areas. I would just dispute a little bit the point of the London situation and the London plan, which is the only part of the country where we do have a strategic development strategy of such. The reason we have a crash of supply in London is not because of strategic planning. It is because of a building safety crisis, it's because of hugely high inflation, it's because of huge land prices, it's because of an absolute crisis in temporary accommodation, and huge pressures that have happened across the social housing sector over the last 15 years in terms of cuts and caps to our income. And so, in order to actually get out of the situation in London and the rest of the country, we do need a comprehensive planning system that's based on objectively assessed need. We need a long-term housing strategy that looks at our existing homes as well as new homes. We need to have a rent settlement, including convergence. We need to have funding that addresses building safety as well as new supply. And these are all things that the government is welcomely looking at. In terms of bringing forward those spatial development strategies in the rest of the country, I think it is really important that they have a focus on social and affordable housing, and that should be mandated within them. The percentages will need to reflect the context of the areas and the need in those areas. So there will need to be kind of a degree of flexibility in accordance with place, but it is vitally important that that is mandated as part of the remit of those strategies, and we welcome them coming forward.
Mr. Stevens, you mentioned local plans briefly in one of your previous answers. Do you feel that the draft bill sufficiently considers the interaction between the proposed spatial development strategies and existing local plan processes? And also, Kate Henderson, it'd be good to hear your views on that as well.
Well, I've been involved in commenting on I think all the last 4 iterations of the London plan, so I can see that it is a successful model in that it does a lot of the heavy lifting for local authorities in terms of identifying broad locations of growth, but in particular setting out the housing requirement for all the constituent local authorities. And once that strategic plan is adopted, it becomes part of the the legal development plan, and it means that whatever stage the local authority is at with the development of its plan, at least the policies, including the policies for the number and distribution of housing set out in that spatial plan, becomes part of the development plan. So it does assist the government in ensuring that its new mandatory standard method is embedded within the planning system as quickly as possible. I've been involved also in all the spatial strategies produced by the mayoral combined authorities to a greater or lesser extent over the last 6 years. And I think the government's measures about reforming the governance so that spatial development strategies, the mayor only needs a sort of majority support rather than unanimity is a very, very important step forward.
Just to add to that, I think returning to a system of strategic spatial planning is really welcome. Actually trying to work out our housing need based on 300 plus local authorities doesn't get us up to the sum total of actually doing things comprehensively. And I think actually also in terms of addressing the housing crisis and addressing economic growth and opportunity, nature recovery, landscapes, our utility provision, how we get to work, we do need to work on a larger than local scale. So I think the ability to coordinate all of that infrastructure at a spatial scale where authorities are working together makes a lot of sense. I think what's going to be a challenge is how we do this in a comprehensive way when there are huge pressures on local authorities in terms of capacity. There are some welcome measures in the bill around ring-fencing planning fees to give some additional capacity there, and we support that. But actually how you do the strategic planning function at both getting local authorities to have local plans in place, getting strategic plans in place, at the same time, and also recognising that we are having local government reorganisation, and we've got the forthcoming English devolution bill. So, for us, what we would really like to see is this long-term housing strategy that is due to come forward this summer to be the overarching framework, thinking about at least the next decade of how we really kind of transform the housing offer to people in this country. And I think, so, there's a question here around boosting capacity in the system. There is also a question of decision-making and where those levels of primacy are going to sit when it comes to decision-making, as you've got lots of different things coming forward. So actually being really clear, if you've got the spatial development strategies coming forward and local plans coming forward, how are they going to interact? How are they going to be democratically consulted on and agreed? And then where is the primacy of decision-making? And I think that that's what we're expecting to come forward with more detail in the secondary legislation and consultations to come.
And if I might just add that, there is a risk, though, that the prospect of a spatial development strategy will slow down local plan making. That's something that we're quite anxious about. That's what we saw in Greater Manchester. The promise of a spatial strategy for Greater Manchester meant that for about 10 years, most of the, I think 9 of the 10 constituent local authorities didn't bother producing a local plan. So the government needs to be very, very clear. It is set out in the explanatory notes to the bill, but the government needs to be very clear that local plan production must not stop under any circumstance.
Thank you very much, Chair. Can I just take the opportunity to thank both of you for talking about the housing crisis that exists in this country. The people that are living in temporary accommodation find themselves homeless. We've had some excellent panel members today who've made outstanding contributions, but I do think you are the first two panel members who've spoken about the existing crisis that is certainly affecting my constituents, and I know many constituents that are represented by members on this panel. The purpose of housing policy, to answer a question that was sort of put out earlier, has a number of reasons. One is to deliver a fundamental human right, which is to have a roof over your head. So I hope you don't mind, Chair, but it was really important to me that I thanked you for that contribution. May I ask you a little bit more about land value? Because as a London Member of Parliament and an ex-council leader, it is by far the most quoted reason why development wasn't coming through in the pipeline development, whether it was from local authorities or the private sector, certainly in the last couple of years, while it was being held up. To what extent do you think the challenges around infrastructure is impacting land value, which is holding up development? And do you think that the bill goes far enough in tackling the length of time and the cost that is currently in play when it comes to infrastructure development that could contribute, that is hindering land value going up that ultimately delivers homes.
That's so by infrastructure, are you referring to, say, really, well, all infrastructure is critical, but really critical infrastructure like utilities, energy and water, which we know is
and transport too. So
yeah.
there are good examples across the country where train stations suddenly, just the prospect of a train station unlocks thousands of homes because the land value means developers are more interested in that area. But the lead up to being able to grant that permission is so lengthy, it feels like a blockage, and I'm wondering, does this bill address what has been a long-standing criticism in this country?
I'm afraid, I mean, London, in terms of its public transport network, is probably the densest of any part of the country. I don't necessarily see that transport infrastructure as being the #1 barrier to housing delivery in London, but I take it you will probably have local experience of that. I live on the Old Kent Road, and that's been promised, the Bakerloo line extension, for a couple of decades, but that hasn't stopped increasing investment in that growth zone, that growth zone is defined by the Mayor.
I was thinking more outside London, to be honest with you, because I think the demand is so great in London that it outstrips.
Well, I think it would be, and I think that's why the enhanced powers under the devolution white paper to be given to the mayors to enable them to do things like bus franchising, to draw in investment to increase, take over trains, increase, passenger numbers, development of public transport infrastructure, I think, is a really critical thing. I think that is holding back the growth of, I think, many of our major cities up in the north. And I go up to Sheffield. Sheffield is certainly a city region which is underperforming against its potential because it just doesn't have that public transport infrastructure.
And I think just to add to that, we know that infrastructure provision, whether it's new reservoirs or capacity on our road or rail, is the key to unlocking a lot of strategic sites. The bill, in terms of some of the the larger infrastructure regime and the speeding up process and the 150 kind of ambitious target on major infrastructure, I think that's all really to be welcome, but I think it's about looking at the country in terms of this long-term housing strategy alongside our transport strategy that's coming forward, around an industrial strategy that's coming forward, and being able to coordinate all of that. You asked the point, though, around land and land value and if that's a barrier. And I was just wondering if it's okay to touch on the point of the clauses in the bill around compulsory purchase, and particularly the clause 91 around hope value, because we are very supportive of clause 91 in the bill, which makes specific provision for hope value to be disregarded for affordable and social housing where this is in the public interest. And we really want this to be embedded across the planning system, and that is because of it's not just the children in temporary accommodation, it's around the ability to create fantastic places that are inclusive, that meet the needs of people throughout their lives and on different incomes. And I think we should be really clear that the act of granting a planning permission is a public good. And this is about fair and reasonable land prices. So it's about compensating at a fair and reasonable level, but also about ensuring that the public can capture that uplift, and that after the planning permission has been granted, and ensuring that that leads to more viable developments where we have a higher proportion of social and affordable housing. And so I just wanted to put on record that we support the CPO powers. Now, CPO is rarely used, but having stronger CPO powers and having them for public authorities is a good thing to try and encourage land to come forward. To do this effectively, of course, we need to have legal expertise, capacity, and there has to be risk appetite in the local authority. That's a challenge right now, but that's something I think that the bill giving those tools to do that is really, really welcome, and then there's some capacity building that needs to happen within local government. But I think just to commend government for bringing forward those measures on hope value, because that is really important in terms of how we meet the housing crisis. Thank you.
We've now come to the end of this session. Can I, on behalf of the committee, thank the panel for the evidence. We now will switch over to a new panel, which we'll hear from the ministers. Well, the ministers are getting in their place. This session will run to 10 to 6. As usual, I'll cut it off at 10 to 6, right on the time. Say to the minister, just say to the ministers, while you've been participating actively in the proceedings, but could I ask you both to formally introduce yourselves for the record, please?
I'm Matthew Pennycook, MP. I'm the Minister of State for Housing and Planning.
Michael Shanks, the Minister for Energy.
We'll start with the shadow spokesperson, Paul Holmes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Twigg, and Ministers. Good afternoon. It's been nice to see you on the other side of the table over there this afternoon. I actually don't intend to ask very many questions because I think that we should be taking, and I should take my responsibilities seriously as Shadow Minister in the line-by-line scrutiny of the legislation, and our amendments as the official opposition which have been tabled today will be published tomorrow, and I think that you should have the right to see those amendments and have your officials and yourself study them in detail before we go into a detailed debate between the two parties. However, Minister Pennycook, I'd just like to ask you around a sustained line of questioning that I've taken on today, and I know that you've also participated in the questioning to other witnesses about Natural England, and you and I have, I think, a differing opinion on, well, maybe we don't actually. Let's see after these questions whether we do. I won't do you a disservice. There has been a consistent response from interested stakeholders about the, as I said earlier, the ability and the resourcing of Natural England. You have outlined to the witness after the Chief Executive of Natural England about whether this will mean that there will be a deterioration or an improvement of environmental factors. But can I just ask you, I was quite concerned by the Chief Executive's representations to the committee this afternoon, not because of her capability, and it's not a slight on her leading her organisation at all, but in terms of the language that was coming back when I said would her organisation be able to cope with that. It was we should, it might, we are not sure yet. We need to go through consultations with government and the Treasury over funding in the spending review. So can I ask you, with some of the reasons that were outlined by the Chief Executive around system changes that need to be coming in, system improvements, investment in computer systems and other, and in the short term a shortfall in some of the income because of the lack of certainty from government. And that's not a criticism, that's the natural spending review period, I get that. Can you outline why you do not share the view that many stakeholders have, which is that Natural England needs to be substantially increased in its resourcing, and that government needs to invest a huge amount to try and get Natural England to a position where it will be able to take on the responsibilities that you're outlining?
Before the Minister answers, just say we've had a significant number of members indicate they wish to ask a question. We have very limited time, as you know, until 10:02, so if I can ask the future questions, obviously there's some scope for the opposition spokesperson,
Sorry.
of course. Of course. But then for as short as questions and as concise as answers as possible. Minister.
Chair, I will take heed and try and be as concise as possible. I'd say, Mr. Holmes, three things. First, we obviously recognise that we need to ensure the system is equipped to deliver. You will have heard from the Chief Executive of Natural England how closely we are working with them on these reforms and ensuring they are operational in short order after royal assent. We've already secured £14 million to support the Nature Restoration Fund. As the Chief Executive made clear, in some instances it may be necessary to provide upfront funding, and we're looking at opportunities to do so we can kick off action in advance of need, with costs recovered as development comes forward. But I think the really important thing in the long term is, once fully established, the Nature Recovery Fund will run on a full cost recovery basis, and we think that is a sustainable way for Natural England to deliver EDPs in the places they need to across England.
Thank you for being so concise. You're more concise than your answer than I was in my question. Just very briefly, can I ask you therefore, what interaction and what engagement have you had with the Treasury in your representations to try and get, have you made representations to the Treasury what have they said to you in terms of you asking for more resourcing? And have you had any early indication of what the Treasury's thoughts are in the spending review round on the need for Natural England to have increased funding?
I fully appreciate and take no issue with you trying, Shadow Minister, but I'm not going to make any comment on the spending review negotiations that are ongoing.
I didn't think you would.
Thank you.
That's it for me. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Chair, and I'm grateful to the ministers for giving up their time. My question was really on the trade-off or the question of whether there's a trade-off between nature and development, and just wanted, given what's been said on previous panels, to give probably Matthew the opportunity to answer that kind of suggestion that somehow this bill is proposing that there is a trade-off. But I also did want to ask the degree to which the government is in listening mode to the organisations, the nature organisations, some of which we heard earlier, in terms of their suggestions around strengthening the bill and what the government's approach is on that. And then lastly, just on the viability test question, which Richard Benwell raised specifically around clause 64 and the concern that, I mean, does the Minister share the concern that subjecting it to the viability test could mean that the amount of funds that come through the levy are not sufficient to, at the very least, if not improve, mitigate? And how can we ensure that that isn't the case, and that even if it is subject to the viability test? Yeah.
Can I just remind
Sorry.
Can we keep questions on? It's entirely up to you. I'm just trying to advise it as short as possible. We get as many honourable members in as possible. Minister.
Thank you, Chair. Taking both in turn, and I think the first is really important, and I'm glad I've had the chance to say so very clearly again, as I did to Mr Benwell. We don't accept as a government that development has to come at the expense of nature. We've put a huge amount of effort and engagement with Mr Benwell's organisation and many, many others, and with other government departments into ensuring that the clauses drafted in this bill will allow us to deliver that win-win for development and the environment. And our confidence that the bill will not undermine or reduce environmental protections is why we confirmed on the face of the bill, under Section 20, it's under the previous Government's Environment Act, that to be the case. And as you heard from the Chief Exec of Natural England, our reforms are very much built around delivering overall positive outcomes for protected sites and species. On the viability point specifically, there are existing, obviously, environmental obligations that developers have to pay to address. What we're doing by moving to a more strategic scale and larger geographies where we can get those better outcomes, we think is allow us to drive down costs through strategic action, through those economies of scale. So we think overall the approach will benefit, but viability we think does have to be a consideration in terms of the levy fee that we will eventually set.
Gideon Amos.
I too am grateful to both the ministers for their time today. In interest of time brevity, I just actually asked a question of the Energy Minister in relation to, there are provisions in the bill around overhead lines and so on, generating stations. Is the government looking at further reforms that would make the delivery of the electricity network simpler and more straightforward with regard to permitted development powers and so forth, permitted development, widening permitted development for the electricity distribution network and transmission network, given the drive we all want to reach net zero and the challenges I know that industry faces?
I think it's a really important question, and probably the single most important part of us being able to achieve our clean power mission will be the grid upgrades that are necessary, many of which should have been done for many decades before, but we now need to build out the grid. So we're looking at a range of options. I think the connections reform is important for making sure we're only building the grid that we absolutely need to build. The bill discounts and the community benefits as well that go with it are all around trying to improve acceptability. But we will look at a range of other issues as well, including around permitted development rights. But I think what we're really clear on is we've got a clear indication of the projects that are necessary to hit clean power by 2030. We know where those need to be built. We know what the barriers are to doing that. We want to move forward with those as quickly as possible. And I think the community acceptability point is key, because probably unlike some of the other parts of our electricity system, pylons and substations are probably the ones that communities have the most challenge with, particularly because they're going through multiple communities in the course of a line. We've evidence that the bill discount scheme will improve that acceptability to help build those much faster. Of course, that's the only way we'll achieve clean power, by getting the power to where it's needed most.
Thank you. Firstly, it's welcome that we've got a government that's working on a bill across departments, so not only planning but also environment. We've heard from the panel today of the move from first come, first serve approach to first ready, first connected for connections to the grid. We know, and we've heard also from other panellists, that in recent years the delivery of new homes across the country has been delayed by grid capacity. We also know this particularly affects SME developers. How will this bill support our SME developers and in turn growth in our communities?
It's a really good question, and to Mr Amos's question, I said network was probably the single most important thing. The connections reform is probably the single most important lever in clearing out what is now 756 gigawatts in a queue to connect, which is frankly an absurd amount. And so we're moving really a fundamental shift to move to first applied, first in the queue, to what is strategically important and is a project actually ready to be connected. We've got, as has been discussed, so many of these zombie projects that take up a space in the queue for years on end. But we also have been really clear that prioritising what is strategically important to our energy mix, particularly on some of the questions around storage, to make sure we actually have the right capacity connecting, is really important. So we want to bring that down as quickly as possible. That frees up the connections process for new generation to join far faster. But the other really important side of it is that for the projects in the queue on the demand side, it frees up capacity for those to connect much quicker as well. We know that the estimates at the moment that are probably conservative based on how quickly the growth of AI and data centres and things is taking hold, but we know that by 2050 the estimate is our demand in this country will double for electricity. So this step in clearing out of the queue now, but also really importantly I think putting in place a process that makes sure the queue doesn't fill back up after we've done this particular clear out is really important. And so the bill details the process that will be taken, but also the role that government will have in setting strategic priorities for future connections queue management. The first stage of that will be the Clean Power Action Plan, but it allows us in the future to look at some other aspects of the economy as well to make sure that we are prioritising those projects that get through. We've resisted the approach of prioritising demand projects because that becomes obviously much more subjective in terms of how you prioritise those, but the clear role will be if we clear out a lot of the 756 gigawatts now, we can connect projects and get the economy growing as a result.
And Minister Pennicook, just around SMEs, like how it's going to help them, obviously, when we've unlocked that grid.
Yep. I think there's a variety of ways in which the bill will help SMEs, although it's probably worth me saying, because we had a variety of questions on issues that aren't directly within the scope of the bill, the New Towns Task Force and Programme, build-out rates, where the government have taken action and are exploring what further steps we can take. So this is not the totality of the interventions we are bringing forward to support SMEs, but a good example would be, just to go back to Mr Murphy's question, the Nature Restoration Fund. We know that nutrient neutrality and diffuse constraints of that kind are particularly affecting SME house builders in those sensitive river catchments. So there are a number of ways in which the provisions in the bill will directly benefit small and medium house builders.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr Twigg. Recent government announcements around housing targets, 1.5 million but only 18,000 to be social homes, have led some to ask questions if the government is doing enough to promote affordable and social housing. Does this bill go far enough, particularly in relation to spatial development strategies, in terms of mandating more in the way of affordable and social housing provision?
Just to correct you on a point made there, I think the 18,000 figure you referenced is solely the figure that we think can be delivered through the £2 billion we secured recently and announced as a down payment on the future grant funding through the successor programme to the Affordable Homes Programme. So that it's not 18,000 affordable homes out of 1.5 million, which would be completely unacceptable.
Social.
We are social. We are trying to, through all of our reforms, deliver the biggest increase in social and affordable house building in a generation. In terms of the top-up, we've already allocated to the Affordable Homes Programme £800 million since coming to office. That £2 billion we've also pulled forward as a down payment. A significant proportion of the homes coming through those funding routes are social rented homes. Almost half, I think, is the figure. I'm happy to provide the committee with the specific figure. So we are getting a huge uplift coming through, and the successor grant programme will give particular priority to social rented homes coming through. In terms of spatial development strategies, where I think this can really add in terms of what we see coming through, is these won't be big local plans, let's be very clear. They need to be pretty high-level documents that make decisions about where housing growth and infrastructure provision is best cited and best delivered on a sub-regional basis. And that will allow, I think, groups of local authorities to take a far more sophisticated approach to, for example, bringing forward large-scale new communities in strategic locations that allow them to meet housing targets in a more sophisticated way. And through other measures we're introducing, the CPO measures in the bill are a good example, capture more land value uplift and deliver more social and affordable homes.
Ellie Charles.
Thank you, Chair. To Minister Pennycook in particular, I welcome your confirmation that you recognise that environmental, social and economic goals can be achieved together, are not automatically or even frequently in contradiction to each other, and likewise welcome your confirmation that, as it says on the face of the bill, the purpose of the government in bringing forward this bill is to retain existing level of environmental protections. Given that commitment from the government, and at the same time the observations that we've heard today from Richard Benwell that there are areas where there are risks which could be addressed through amendments, and indeed from Marion Spain that the bill needs to have robust safeguards, and there may be drafting amendments that will make it more robust. Can I return to the question that actually Mr Murphy asked? Can you confirm that you retain an open mind, that you may consider tabling further government amendments perhaps in response to the concerns that have been raised, in order to ensure that the bill does what you're saying on the face of it, the face of the tin it does?
Appreciate the question. Just to reiterate, and this is where I slightly would disagree with Mr Benwell and others, we're very clear that the bill will not have the effect of reducing the level of environmental protections in terms of existing environmental law. Very clear about that, very confident in the safeguards that exist in the bill. I'm very happy to look at, as we will do in the normal course of the bill, and we'll debate each of them in turn and keep an open mind about any amendment that we think is feasible, workable, and aligns with the objectives of the bill and delivers what we want to see. Absolutely, and we'll debate all those in course. And we have, as you rightly made clear, have tabled a package of government amendments yesterday. And some of those amendments, just to bring it back to the specific point, some of those amendments on removing the statutory requirement for pre-application consultation in relation to nationally significant infrastructure projects were partly because we were getting feedback through the working paper, but also because there were a number of calls at second reading, very specifically for us to look at that area of reform. So we will respond, as you would expect in the normal course of the bill, to challenge, to criticism, to scrutiny, and any amendments that we debate in due course.
No more questions? Okay, there are no more questions. I would like to thank all our witnesses from across the day. Sorry, did you? I think we literally got 30 seconds. Okay. Yeah, so I thank all our witnesses across the day for evidence and invite the government whip to propose the adjournment. The question is that further consideration of the bill be now adjourned, and many of that opinion say aye. Aye. On the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes